Welcome, dear friend, to a tale of loyalty unwavering and heart unbreakable. Tonight, we follow the extraordinary journey of Ronald Bilious Weasley, a boy whose courage was often overshadowed but never diminished, whose friendship proved stronger than fame, and whose heart beat true through every trial. As you settle into your cozy bed, let these words carry you through the life of perhaps the most genuinely human hero in the wizarding world. Close your eyes and drift into this chronicle of friendship and bravery, where every insecurity was overcome and every act of love mattered more than glory itself. In the rolling hills of Devon, where ancient magic flowed through hedgerow and stream, there stood a house that defied every law of architecture and common sense. The Burrow rose like a wonderful impossibility against the English countryside, its rooms stacked upon each other in precarious harmony, held together by magic and the unshakable love of the family who dwelled within its crooked walls. It was here, on the first day of March in 1980, that Ronald Bilious Weasley drew his first breath, entering a world that would challenge him, shape him, and ultimately celebrate the extraordinary heart that beat within his ordinary chest. The morning of his birth was crisp and clear, with daffodils pushing through the last patches of winter snow and the air carrying whispers of spring's promise. Molly Weasley, exhausted but radiant, cradled her sixth child while Arthur paced the kitchen below, his hands trembling not from nerves, but from the overwhelming joy that came with welcoming another soul into their chaotic, loving household. Ron's first cry was lusty and strong, announcing to the world that another Weasley had arrived to claim his place in the magnificent pandemonium that was their family life. From his earliest moments, Ron existed in a universe of hand-me-downs and shared spaces, where nothing was truly his alone but everything was infused with the warmth of family love. His cradle had rocked 5 brothers before him, worn smooth by countless nights of gentle motion, its wooden rails bearing the teething marks of previous occupants who had grown into the tall, red-headed young men who now peered down at him with mixture of affection and resigned acceptance that their mother's attention would be divided once again. The Burrow itself seemed to expand to accommodate its newest resident, rooms stretching and walls shifting in the way that magical houses do when love requires more space than physics would normally allow. Ron's nursery occupied a corner of his parents' room, separated by a curtain that Molly had embroidered with dancing snitches and flying broomsticks, her needle creating tiny miracles of colour and movement that would mesmerize the infant for hours as they shifted and played in the afternoon sunlight. Bill, the eldest at 9, took his role as big brother with characteristic seriousness, reading to the baby from picture books about dragons and heroes, while Charlie, 7 and already obsessed with anything that had wings, insisted that Ron would grow up to be a Quidditch player because he kicked so strongly in his blankets. Percy, 5 and precociously intellectual, pronounced the baby adequately formed but noted that his hands were too small for proper quill holding, while the 3-year-old twins, Fred and George, regarded their new brother with the calculating look that would become their trademark, already plotting ways to include him in their elaborate schemes of chaos and mischief. The house around Ron hummed with constant activity that would shape his understanding of what family meant. Breakfast tables groaned under the weight of porridge bowls and toast racks that refilled themselves through Molly's careful magic, while the washing up did itself in the sink with energetic splashing that sent sudsy bubbles floating through the kitchen air. The wireless crackled with Quidditch commentary and wizarding news, its volume rising and falling as Arthur adjusted it between bites of marmalade-laden toast and Molly's gentle scolding about table manners. As Ron grew from infant to toddler, the Burrow's peculiar geography became his normal landscape. Stairs that moved when no one was looking, led to rooms that were bigger inside than outside, where windows showed views that changed depending on the time of day and the mood of the house itself. His earliest memories were painted in the warm colors of firelight and family laughter, of being passed from brother to brother like a precious but slightly squirmy package, each one teaching him something different about what it meant to be a Weasley. Bill showed him how to tie his shoes with loops that wouldn't come undone even during the most vigorous play, his patient fingers guiding Ron's smaller ones through the rabbit ear method, while explaining that big brothers always helped little brothers learn important things. Charlie lifted him onto his shoulders for tours of the garden, pointing out the different creatures that lived in the vegetable patches and explaining that dragons were just very large, very exciting versions of the garden gnomes that liked to hide among the cabbages. Percy read to him from educational books about proper wizarding history and magical theory, his young voice taking on pompous tones that would become more pronounced with age. As he explained the importance of understanding one's heritage and excelling in one's studies, the twins, Fred and George, included him in their adventures with the kind of casual acceptance that made Ron feel like he belonged, even when those adventures resulted in minor explosions or mysteriously color-changing porridge that made Molly throw her hands up in exasperation. The poverty that marked the Weasley household was a constant presence but never felt like true hardship to Ron in those early years, cushioned as it was by the abundance of love and laughter that filled every corner of their home. His clothes were passed down from brother to brother, each garment carrying the history of previous wearers in stretched elbows and faded patches that spoke of adventures and growth spurts and the simple passage of time. His toys were similarly inherited, wooden blocks worn smooth by countless small hands, stuffed animals that had been loved nearly bare by previous generations of Weasley children. But Molly's magic transformed these humble possessions into treasures that felt specially made for each child. A toy broomstick that had carried all his brothers learned to respond to Ron's particular way of gripping the handle, rising just high enough off the ground to give him the thrill of flight without the terror of falling. Hand-knitted sweaters stretched and shrank to fit his changing body perfectly, their wool soft from years of careful washing, and their colors as bright as the day they had been created by needles that moved with their own loving intelligence. Ron's room, when he finally graduated from the nursery to his own space on the 5th floor, became his sanctuary and his burden in equal measure. The top floor of the burrow was reached by stairs that creaked ominously and swayed gently in strong winds, making the journey to bed an adventure that sometimes required actual courage. His room was small and oddly shaped, with a ceiling that slanted sharply on one side and walls that weren't quite parallel, creating a space that felt like the inside of a ship's cabin or a bird's nest built by an architect with more enthusiasm than skill. Every inch of wall space was covered with posters of the Chudley Cannons, Ron's beloved Quidditch team whose orange robes blazed like sunset against the whitewashed walls. The players moved constantly in their frames, practicing formation flying and spectacular saves that Ron would study for hours, memorizing every move and imagining himself joining their ranks someday. The team's motto, "Let's all just keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best," became Ron's unofficial philosophy during those early years when hoping seemed like the most powerful magic he possessed. Above his room, in the house's cramped attic, lived the family ghoul, a creature whose nocturnal wanderings provided a constant soundtrack of bumps, crashes, and occasional mournful wailing that filtered down through the thin ceiling. The ghoul had been part of the burrow for generations, a family tradition that served both as security system and source of perpetual annoyance, particularly for Ron, who bore the brunt of its restless energy due to his proximity to its domain. Sleep in the Weasley household was a fluid concept, with the ghoul's activities providing irregular percussion to the symphony of snores, dream-talking, and midnight wanderings that characterized a house filled with growing boys. Ron learned to sleep through crashes that would wake the dead, and to distinguish between the ghouls' routine rearrangement of attic furniture and the more ominous sounds that meant someone was actually in trouble and needed help. The kitchen, 3 floors below Ron's room but connected to it by the invisible threads of family routine, served as the house's heart and command center. Molly ruled this domain with gentle tyranny, her wand conducting orchestras of self-stirring pots and self-washing dishes, while she simultaneously monitored homework, mediated disputes, and dispensed the kind of practical wisdom that kept large families functioning. The kitchen table, scarred by years of homework sessions and craft projects, expanded and contracted according to need, accommodating anywhere from 2 to 12 people with equal grace. Ron's earliest memories of family meals were lessons in controlled chaos, with conversations flowing in multiple directions, while food appeared and disappeared with magical efficiency. He learned to grab rolls from passing platters and to duck flying elbows without missing a beat of whatever story was being told. The Weasley dinner table was a democratic institution, where even the youngest voice was heard, though not always immediately, and where laughter was as essential as salt and pepper. Arthur's presence at these meals was a source of particular joy for Ron, who worshipped his father with the uncomplicated adoration that children reserve for parents who seem to know everything about the world and find it endlessly fascinating. Arthur would arrive home from the Ministry of Magic with his robes slightly askew and his hair perpetually messy, carrying stories of Muggle artifacts and bureaucratic adventures that made even the most mundane workday sound like an expedition into unknown territory. The conversations that flowed around the dinner table were Ron's first education in the wider wizarding world, a curriculum that included everything from Quidditch statistics to ministry politics to the proper way to de-gnome a garden without actually harming the gnomes, who were, after all, just doing what gnomes did naturally. He absorbed information about spellcasting and creature care, about the importance of standing up to bullies, and the greater importance of standing up for friends, about the difference between rule-breaking that was merely mischievous and rule-breaking that was genuinely wrong. The Burrow's garden provided another classroom entirely, a wonderland of magical plants and creatures that existed in harmony with the more mundane vegetables that supplied the family table. Ron learned to identify the whistle of a mandrake seedling and the distinctive scurrying of garden gnomes, to tell the difference between herbs that were merely aromatic and those that were actually magical, to understand that magic and nature were partners in creating the abundance that surrounded their home. His brothers took turns serving as his guides through this outdoor wonderland, each bringing their own areas of expertise and enthusiasm to his education. Bill showed him how to prune the witch hazel without getting hexed by its defensive spells, while Charlie demonstrated the proper way to approach the family roosters, who had developed an unfortunate tendency to breathe small bursts of flame when startled. Percy catalogued the garden's contents with scientific precision, creating detailed lists of every plant and its magical properties, while the twins delighted in showing Ron which flowers could be turned into stink bombs and which vegetables made the most spectacular explosions when combined with certain household ingredients. The seasonal rhythms of the Burrow became the calendar by which Ron measured his growing years. Spring meant helping with the planting, his small hands learning to distinguish between legitimate seedlings and weeds that had learned to masquerade as vegetables. Summer brought long days of outdoor adventures, games of Quidditch that started at dawn and lasted until Molly's voice calling them for dinner could no longer be ignored. Evenings spent catching fireflies that glowed with more than natural light and listening to Arthur tell stories about his own childhood adventures. Autumn was harvest time, when the entire family worked together to bring in crops that had been enhanced by careful magic to produce far more than any Muggle garden of similar size could yield. Ron learned to sort apples that sorted themselves when no one was looking, to handle pumpkins that occasionally tried to roll away from their harvesters, and to identify the signs that told you when magical vegetables were truly ripe and ready for picking. Winter transformed the Burrow into a fortress of warmth and light against the cold darkness outside, with fires that burned in grates throughout the house and magical warmth that seeped from the walls themselves. The long winter evenings were filled with activities that brought the family together in the sitting room, where Molly's knitting needles clicked with rhythmic precision as she created sweaters and scarves for everyone, where Arthur tinkered with Muggle devices that he was trying to understand, and where the children played games, told stories, and occasionally broke into impromptu concerts of wizard songs that made the windows rattle with their enthusiasm. Ron's place in this family constellation was complex and sometimes painful, even in those early years when the sharp edges of jealousy and insecurity were still blunted by childhood's natural optimism. He was neither the eldest, with Bill's natural authority and charm, nor the youngest, a position that would eventually be claimed by Ginny when she arrived to complete the Weasley family. He was not the academic star like Percy, nor the athletic hero like Charlie, nor the entertainment duo like Fred and George. He was simply Ron, the middle child who sometimes felt lost in the shuffle of more distinctive personalities. But even in his moments of childhood confusion about where exactly he fit, Ron was surrounded by evidence of his family's love and acceptance. His brothers included him in their activities with the casual assumption that he belonged there, never questioning his right to participate in whatever adventure they were planning. Molly fussed over him with the same devoted attention she gave to all her children. Her maternal magic, ensuring that he always had clean clothes, hot meals, and the kind of unconditional support that makes children feel secure in their place in the world. Arthur's relationship with Ron was particularly special, perhaps because they shared a certain bemused wonder at the world around them and a tendency to find fascination in things that others might overlook. Arthur would spend hours explaining how Muggle devices worked, his eyes lighting up with genuine curiosity about the ingenuity of people who managed to create magic without actually having magic. These conversations planted seeds in Ron's young mind about the value of different kinds of intelligence and the importance of appreciating what others brought to the world. The pranks and mischief that were endemic to Weasley family life served as another form of education, teaching Ron about consequences and forgiveness, about the difference between humor that brought joy and humor that caused real harm. The twins' experiments sometimes went wrong in spectacular fashion, like the time they convinced Ron to eat an acid pop that burned a hole clear through his tongue, leaving him temporarily unable to speak clearly, and earning the twins a lecture from Molly that made the kitchen windows steam with her indignation. But even when pranks backfired, the family's response was measured and focused on learning rather than punishment. Ron's burned tongue healed within hours, thanks to Molly's healing spells, and the incident became a family story that was retold with decreasing drama and increasing humor as time passed. The twins learned to be more careful about testing their inventions on unsuspecting siblings, while Ron learned to be more skeptical of sweets offered by brothers whose eyes held too much mischief. The Burrow's unique architecture provided endless opportunities for childhood adventure and discovery. Rooms that seemed to exist in spaces too small to hold them contained treasures from previous generations of Weasleys. Trunks filled with old photographs and letters, magical devices whose purposes had been forgotten, but whose potential for entertainment remained high. Ron spent countless hours exploring these spaces, sometimes alone and sometimes with whichever brother was available for adventure, uncovering family history through the physical remnants of lives lived within these crooked walls. The house's magical nature meant that it responded to the emotional states of its inhabitants in ways that were subtle but profound. During times of family harmony, The stairs were stable and the doors opened easily, as if the building itself was pleased with the peace that reigned within its walls. During conflicts or periods of stress, the architecture became more temperamental, with stairs that might skip a step without warning and doors that required extra effort to open, forcing the family to work together to navigate their own home. Ron's early years were measured not by external milestones but by internal growth, by the gradual development of the loyalty and courage that would define his character throughout his life. He learned to stand up for brothers who were being teased, even when the teasing was coming from other brothers, developing an early understanding that family loyalty was more important than temporary alliances. He learned to share not just possessions but attention, making room for others' accomplishments, even when his own achievements felt small by comparison. The wireless radio that played constantly in the kitchen provided Ron's first window into the larger wizarding world beyond the Burrow's protective embrace. Quidditch matches, news reports, and entertainment programs created a soundtrack for family life, while introducing concepts and concerns that would become increasingly important as he grew older. The voices that emerged from the wireless spoke of a magical community that was vast and complex, filled with opportunities and dangers that existed far beyond the safe boundaries of home. As Ron approached his 11th birthday, the reality of Hogwarts began to loom larger in family conversations. His older brother's stories of school life painted pictures of adventure and learning that were both exciting and intimidating, filled with possibilities that seemed almost too wonderful to believe, and challenges that seemed almost too difficult to overcome. The prospect of leaving the Burrow, even temporarily, was both thrilling and terrifying for a boy who had never spent a night away from the warm chaos of family life. His room, with its Chudley Cannon's posters and slanted ceiling, began to feel both too small and too precious as the date of his departure approached. This space that had been his sanctuary and his burden would soon be empty of his presence, waiting patiently for his return during holidays, while he learned to navigate the wider world beyond its familiar walls. The ghoul overhead seemed to sense the approaching change, its nightly wanderings becoming more restless, as if it too would miss the company of the boy who had shared its corner of the house for so many years. The last months of Ron's childhood were filled with preparations both practical and emotional, as Molly began assembling the collection of second-hand textbooks and barely adequate robes that would outfit her 6th son for his magical education. Each item added to his school trunk carried the weight of family history and family pride, hand-me-downs that had served previous Weasleys well, and would, with luck and careful handling, serve Ron equally well in his turn. But beneath the excitement of impending adventure lay a deeper current of anxiety about living up to the standards that his brothers had set. Bill's academic achievements, Charlie's Quidditch stardom, Percy's perfectionism. Each had carved out a distinct identity at Hogwarts, leaving Ron to wonder what unique contribution he might make to the family legacy. The question of his own special talents remained unanswered as his childhood drew to its close, a puzzle that would follow him onto the Hogwarts Express and into the next chapter of his extraordinary ordinary life. The September morning that changed Ron Weasley's life forever dawned grey and drizzly over London, with clouds hanging low above King's Cross Station like a soggy blanket that threatened to muffle all the excitement and terror of new beginnings. Platform 9 3/4 shimmered with the controlled chaos of families saying goodbye, trunks being loaded onto scarlet carriages, and the nervous energy of children about to embark on adventures they couldn't yet imagine. Ron stood beside his parents and siblings, his second-hand robes hanging slightly loose on his lanky frame, clutching a battered cage that housed Scabbers, the family rat who had previously belonged to Percy, and seemed thoroughly unimpressed by this change in ownership. The Hogwarts Express gleamed like a promise in the station's artificial twilight, its scarlet paint reflecting the magical barrier that separated the wizarding platform from the Muggle world beyond. Steam hissed from its brass fittings while uniformed witches and wizards checked tickets and helped younger students navigate the organized pandemonium of departure day. Ron had dreamed of this moment for years, imagining himself boarding the train with the confidence of his older brothers. But the reality was more overwhelming than his fantasies had prepared him for. Molly fussed over his appearance one final time, smoothing his unruly red hair and adjusting his robes with the kind of maternal magic that had nothing to do with wands and everything to do with love expressed through attention to detail. Her eyes were bright with tears she was trying not to shed, understanding that this moment marked the beginning of her sixth son's transformation from boy to young wizard. Arthur stood nearby, his hand resting gently on Ron's shoulder, offering the kind of quiet support that spoke volumes about the bond between father and son. The twins, Fred and George, had already claimed their usual compartment and were entertaining a crowd of younger students with demonstrations of their latest magical innovations, their laughter carrying across the platform like music. Percy stood stiffly beside his parents, his prefect badge gleaming importantly on his robes, offering last-minute advice about study habits and rule adherence that Ron only half listened to, while his attention was drawn to the magical spectacle surrounding them. It was then, in the midst of this family farewell, that Ron first encountered the boy who would change his life in ways that no fortune teller could have predicted. Harry Potter approached the magical barrier between platforms with the hesitant confusion of someone who had never navigated the wizarding world's hidden passages, his distinctive lightning bolt scar partially concealed by messy black hair that reminded Ron somehow of his father's perpetually disheveled appearance. The encounter that followed would become legendary in Ron's memory, though at the time it felt like simple human kindness responding to obvious need. Molly's natural maternal instincts engaged immediately when she saw the lost boy struggling to understand how to reach the magical platform, her voice carrying the warm authority that had guided 6 Weasley children through countless challenges and adventures. Ron watched with mixture of curiosity and admiration as his mother explained the process of running straight at the solid barrier, her matter-of-fact tone making the impossible sound perfectly reasonable. The boy's gratitude was genuine and touching, speaking to a loneliness that Ron recognized, despite his own family's overwhelming presence in his life. But it was Fred's casual announcement that transformed curiosity into fascination, his voice carrying easily across the platform as he informed the family that the boy they had just helped was none other than Harry Potter, the famous boy who lived. Ron's initial skepticism was natural, born from years of experience with his brother's tendency to embellish stories for dramatic effect. But the evidence was literally before his eyes in the form of the legendary scar that marked Harry as the child who had survived the unsurvivable. The train journey that followed became the foundation of a friendship that would define both boys' lives for years to come. Ron found himself sharing a compartment with the most famous wizard of their generation, a situation that would have terrified many children but felt surprisingly natural given Harry's obvious desire for normal human connection. The conversation that flowed between them revealed the strange symmetry of their situations, each fascinated by what the other took for granted, each offering the other a window into a completely different way of experiencing the magical world. Ron's embarrassment about his homemade sandwiches spoke to insecurities that went deeper than simple poverty, touching on his awareness that everything about his Hogwarts experience would be colored by the family's financial limitations. The corned beef sandwiches that Molly had packed with such care represented love expressed through practical necessity, but to Ron they felt like additional evidence that he would always be marked as different, as less than the other students who could afford to buy treats from the trolley witch without a second thought. Harry's generous response to Ron's situation revealed character traits that would prove crucial throughout their friendship, his instinctive understanding that sharing abundance was more important than maintaining social boundaries. The pile of sweets that Harry purchased wasn't just food but an offering of friendship, a gesture that said more about his values than any grand speech could have conveyed. Ron's acceptance of this generosity, despite his embarrassment, marked the beginning of his education in receiving kindness gracefully. The appearance of Hermione Granger in their compartment introduced a third dynamic that would prove essential to the trio's eventual formation, though the initial encounter was marked more by friction than friendship. Her know-it-all attitude and obvious academic preparation contrasted sharply with Ron's more casual approach to his magical education, creating tension that reflected deeper differences in their backgrounds and priorities. Her criticism of Ron's attempted magic spell, delivered with characteristic bluntness, stung particularly, because it highlighted his insecurity about his abilities compared to students who seemed naturally gifted or better prepared. Draco Malfoy's introduction to their growing circle provided Ron with his first direct encounter with the kind of prejudice that divided the wizarding world along lines of blood, purity, and family wealth. Malfoy's dismissive attitude toward the Weasley family's financial situation and his attempt to position himself as Harry's guide to proper wizarding society revealed the subtle and not-so-subtle ways that class distinctions operated within magical communities. Ron's anger at these slights was immediate and visceral, born from years of feeling defensive about his family's circumstances. Harry's rejection of Malfoy's overtures, delivered with quiet dignity that impressed Ron enormously, demonstrated that fame hadn't corrupted his ability to distinguish between genuine friendship and opportunistic social climbing. This moment established patterns that would characterize their relationship throughout their school years, with Harry consistently choosing loyalty and authenticity over social advantage or easy popularity. The sorting hat ceremony that welcomed the first years to Hogwarts carried weight that went beyond simple house assignment, representing each student's introduction to the competitive dynamics that would shape their educational experience. Ron's placement in Gryffindor felt both inevitable and relieving, continuing a family tradition that stretched back generations while ensuring that he would share a house with his new friend Harry. The cheers that greeted his sorting came not just from current Gryffindors, but from the long table where his brothers sat, their approval warming him despite his attempts to appear nonchalant about the whole process. Harry's sorting into the same house completed what felt like destiny, confirming that their friendship would have the institutional support of shared dormitories, common rooms, and house loyalty. The relief on Harry's face when the hat announced its decision was visible even from Ron's position at the Gryffindor table, speaking to his new friend's anxiety about finding his place in this strange new world. The feast that followed provided Ron with his first taste of Hogwarts luxury. Food that appeared and disappeared through magic that was more sophisticated than anything the Burrow's practical enchantments could produce. The abundance was almost overwhelming after a lifetime of carefully portioned meals, but Ron's natural appetite and his brother's example helped him navigate the social complexities of magical dining. The conversations that flowed around the table introduced him to classmates who would become friends, rivals, and everything in between over the coming years. Ron's academic performance in those first weeks revealed both his potential and his limitations, shaped by a childhood that had emphasized practical magic over theoretical study. His tendency to arrive late to classes spoke to his difficulty adjusting to the structured schedule after a lifetime of more flexible family routines. The homework assignments that seemed manageable to students like Hermione felt overwhelming to Ron, whose educational preparation had been more informal and whose study habits were still developing. Professor McGonagall's transfiguration classes proved particularly challenging, requiring the kind of focused concentration that came naturally to some students but had to be cultivated deliberately by others. Ron's attempts to transform matchsticks into needles resulted in objects that were neither fully one thing nor the other. Stubborn hybrid creations that reflected his own position between childhood and adolescence, between ordinary boy and developing wizard. Potions with Professor Snape introduced Ron to his first experience of teacher prejudice, as the intimidating potions master made clear his disdain for students who didn't demonstrate immediate brilliance in his subject. Ron's attempts to follow complex brewing instructions while dealing with Snape's hostile scrutiny resulted in cauldrons that bubbled ominously and produced results that bore little resemblance to their intended effects. The humiliation of these failures was compounded by Snape's obvious favoritism towards Slytherin students, creating an atmosphere where success felt impossible and failure seemed predetermined. Defense against the dark arts under Professor Quirrell provided a different kind of challenge, as Ron struggled to reconcile the theoretical knowledge of dark creatures and defensive spells with his growing awareness that such threats might be more than academic concerns. Quirrell's nervous demeanor and obvious incompetence created a classroom environment where students learned more from each other than from their instructor, fostering informal study groups and peer teaching that would become important throughout their education. The social dynamics of Gryffindor House revealed themselves gradually as Ron navigated the complex relationships between students from different backgrounds and with different ambitions. The dormitory he shared with Harry, Neville Longbottom, Dean Thomas, and Seamus Finnegan became a microcosm of the broader wizarding world, with each boy bringing different perspectives and experiences that enriched their collective understanding while sometimes creating friction over seemingly minor differences. Neville's obvious anxiety about living up to his family's expectations resonated with Ron's own concerns about matching his brother's achievements, creating a bond between them that was based on shared insecurity as much as genuine friendship. Dean's easy confidence and Muggle background provided insights into non-magical perspectives that fascinated Ron, whose father's interest in Muggle artifacts had prepared him to appreciate the ingenuity of people who accomplished magic without actually having magic. The Quidditch season brought Ron's first experience of Hogwarts as a spectator, rather than participant, watching from the stands as Harry joined the Gryffindor team in the unprecedented position of first-year seeker. Ron's pride in his friend's achievement was genuine and wholehearted, unmarred by the jealousy that might have affected someone less secure in their friendship. His understanding of Quidditch strategy and his passionate support for the Gryffindor team made him an ideal companion for Harry's introduction to competitive flying. The Halloween troll incident that cemented the trio's friendship emerged from Ron's thoughtless comment about Hermione, a casual cruelty that reflected his discomfort with her academic superiority rather than genuine malice. His immediate regret when he learned that his words had hurt her feelings revealed the essential kindness that lay beneath his sometimes prickly exterior. The rescue mission that followed, undertaken without hesitation despite the obvious danger, demonstrated courage that was instinctive rather than calculated. The battle with the troll itself was chaotic and terrifying, a crash course in practical magic that no classroom could have provided. Ron's contribution to their victory came not from advanced spell work but from quick thinking and willingness to act when action was needed, using Hermione's own knowledge against the creature in a way that highlighted the value of collaboration over individual heroics. The aftermath, with Hermione taking responsibility for their rule-breaking, marked the moment when three separate individuals became a unified group. The mystery of the Philosopher's Stone that emerged gradually throughout their first year provided Ron with his first experience of conspiracy and intrigue, as the trio pieced together clues about threats to the school and attempts to steal something valuable enough to kill for. Ron's contributions to their investigations drew on knowledge gained through his brother's experiences and his family's deep connections to the wizarding world, information that proved crucial in understanding the scope of the danger they faced. The chess match that would define Ron's moment of glory represented the culmination of skills he had been developing since childhood. Games played in the Burrow's sitting room with brothers who had taught him to think several moves ahead and to accept losses as learning opportunities. The magical chess set that guarded one of the stone's protections was larger and more intimidating than anything he had previously encountered, but the underlying principles remained the same. His decision to sacrifice himself for the greater good was made without hesitation or drama. A simple recognition that the mission's success was more important than individual safety. The physical pain of being struck down by the opposing queen was sharp and immediate, but the emotional satisfaction of enabling his friends to continue was deeper and more lasting. Waking up in the hospital wing to learn that their mission had succeeded provided validation that his sacrifice had meaning beyond mere gesture. Ron's second year began with the kind of adventure that would have been unimaginable to his younger self, as he and his brothers mounted a rescue mission to free Harry from his Muggle relative's imprisonment. The flying Ford Anglia that carried them on this unauthorized expedition represented everything that was both wonderful and dangerous about magical transportation. A vehicle that combined Muggle engineering with wizarding enhancements in ways that Arthur Weasley found fascinating and Molly found deeply concerning. The rescue itself went smoothly, with Harry's gratitude and relief making it clear that their intervention had been both necessary and welcome. Ron's tour of the Burrow through Harry's eyes revealed how thoroughly he had internalized his family's circumstances, seeing their home's eccentricities as sources of embarrassment rather than charm. Harry's obvious delight in everything from the self-washing dishes to the family ghoul helped Ron understand that poverty, when accompanied by love and magic, could create wonders that money couldn't buy. The disaster at King's Cross Station that prevented Ron and Harry from boarding the Hogwarts Express normally marked the beginning of a series of catastrophes that would define Ron's second year. The decision to use the flying car for their journey to school seemed logical at the time, a creative solution to an urgent problem that demonstrated the kind of resourcefulness that Gryffindors were supposed to possess. The reality proved far more complicated and dangerous than their planning had anticipated. The journey itself began with excitement and optimism. Two 12-year-old boys flying through clouds and countryside in a car that should have been invisible to Muggle observation. The failure of the invisibility booster transformed their adventure into a nightmare of exposure, with Muggle witnesses reporting sightings of a flying vehicle that violated every statute designed to maintain the separation between magical and non-magical worlds. Ron's horror at this development reflected his deep understanding of how seriously the Ministry took breaches of the International Statute of Secrecy. The car's increasing mechanical problems during their flight to Scotland provided a crash course in the reliability of magical devices under stress, as systems that had worked perfectly under controlled conditions began failing when subjected to the demands of actual emergency use. Ron's growing panic as the engine coughed and the steering became unresponsive was matched by Harry's determination to reach their destination, despite mounting evidence that their plan was fundamentally flawed. The arrival at Hogwarts that should have been triumphant became instead a humiliating spectacle, as the car deposited them unceremoniously on the grounds before driving itself into the forbidden forest to live wild. Ron's broken wand, snapped during their rough landing, became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with their grand adventure. The replacement wand that might have restored his magical capabilities was beyond his family's financial means, leaving him to struggle through the term with a damaged instrument that made every spell an exercise in frustration. The howler that arrived from Molly the next morning at breakfast provided public confirmation of the trouble they had caused, its magically amplified voice carrying her anger and disappointment to every corner of the Great Hall. Ron's humiliation was complete and visible, his face burning as red as his hair, while hundreds of students witnessed his family's business being aired in the most public possible forum. The laughter that followed him for days afterward was a constant reminder that fame could be as much curse as blessing. The Chamber of Secrets crisis that dominated their second year provided Ron with his first direct experience of the kind of ancient magical threats that existed within Hogwarts walls. The attacks on Muggle-born students created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that affected every aspect of school life, turning corridors that had felt safe into potentially dangerous spaces where monsters might lurk behind any corner. Ron's immediate suspicion that Draco Malfoy was responsible for opening the chamber reflected both his natural dislike of his Slytherin rival and his understanding of the pure blood prejudices that would make such an attack appealing to certain wizarding families. The Polyjuice Potion plot that he, Harry, and Hermione devised to investigate their suspicions represented a level of rule-breaking that went far beyond anything they had previously attempted, requiring skills and resources that pushed their capabilities to their limits. The brewing process itself took place in an abandoned bathroom haunted by Moaning Myrtle, a ghost whose tragic history would prove more relevant to their investigation than they initially realized. Ron's transformation into Vincent Crabbe was successful but deeply unpleasant, forcing him to inhabit the body of someone he despised while maintaining the mental discipline necessary to extract information without revealing his true identity. The interrogation of Malfoy in the Slytherin common room yielded disappointing results, revealing that their primary suspect was not responsible for the attacks while failing to provide alternative explanations for the chamber's opening. Ron's relief that Malfoy wasn't the heir of Slytherin was tempered by frustration that their dangerous and illegal investigation had produced no useful information about the real threat facing the school. The discovery of Tom Riddle's diary and its connection to the chamber's previous opening 50 years earlier provided new leads that seemed promising until they began to understand the diary's true nature. Ron's examination of the trophy that bore Tom Riddle's name for special services to the school gave him an uncomfortable familiarity with the award winner's identity, though the full significance of this connection wouldn't become clear until much later. Hermione's petrification struck Ron like a physical blow, removing the intellectual anchor of their trio at the moment when her knowledge and analytical skills were most desperately needed. His grief and anger at seeing his friend frozen in the hospital wing was compounded by guilt that they hadn't been able to protect her from the monster that stalked the school's corridors. The note clutched in her petrified hand would prove crucial to solving the mystery, but its discovery came too late to prevent the tragedy of her attack. The revelation that Ginny had been taken into the chamber itself transformed an intellectual puzzle into a desperately personal crisis, as Ron faced the possibility of losing his only sister to the monster that had already claimed so many victims. His determination to participate in the rescue mission, despite his broken wand and limited magical capabilities, demonstrated the fierce family loyalty that defined his character above all other traits. The journey into the chamber with Harry and the incompetent Professor Lockhart became an exercise in controlled terror as they descended through pipes and passages that had been designed to keep intruders out rather than provide easy access. Lockhart's attempt to erase their memories using Ron's broken wand backfired spectacularly, causing a cave-in that separated Ron from Harry and left him to deal with a professor who no longer remembered his own identity. Ron's vigil in the collapsed tunnel while Harry continued alone into the chamber's heart was perhaps the most difficult part of the entire adventure, requiring him to maintain hope and readiness while having no control over events that would determine his sister's fate. His methodical work to clear the debris that blocked their escape route provided a constructive outlet for his anxiety while preparing for whatever condition Harry and Ginny might be in when they returned. The reunion with Ginny, unconscious but alive, was worth every moment of fear and frustration that had preceded it, proving that love and determination could overcome even ancient magical threats. Ron's joy at his sister's survival was matched by his awe at Harry's account of his battle with the basilisk and the teenage Tom Riddle, adventures that seemed to belong in the legendary tales that Ron had heard throughout his childhood. The end of term brought recognition for their heroic actions and the lifting of the fear that had oppressed the school for months, but also questions about how such events could have been prevented and what other dangers might be lurking within Hogwarts' ancient walls. Ron's growth during this crisis was evident in his willingness to face mortal danger for the sake of others. His ability to function effectively, despite his damaged equipment, and his understanding that heroism often involved unglamorous work, like clearing rubble, while others fought more dramatic battles. The summer that followed provided time for reflection on the year's events and preparation for challenges that lay ahead, as Ron began to understand that his friendship with Harry Potter would inevitably involve encounters with forces that most wizards never faced. His family's pride in his actions during the chamber crisis helped heal some of the wounds left by the flying car incident, while his growing confidence in his own abilities prepared him for the more complex adventures that awaited them in the years to come. The summer of 1993 descended upon the Burrow like a blessing wrapped in golden sunlight and gentle rain, bringing with it the sweet relief of normalcy after the terrors of the Chamber of Secrets. Ron found himself treasuring these peaceful months in ways he had never appreciated before, understanding now how precious ordinary family life could be when contrasted with the deadly adventures that seemed to follow him and Harry wherever they went. The familiar sounds of his mother's cooking, his father's enthusiastic discussions of Muggle artifacts, and the twins' experimental explosions from their room felt like music after the silence of fear that had oppressed Hogwarts for so many months. But even this idyllic interlude was marked by an undercurrent of concern that would prove prophetic as the summer progressed. Scabbers, the family rat who had been Ron's reluctant companion for so many years, began showing signs of illness that no amount of rat tonic could cure. The creature that had once been plump and sleek grew thin and nervous, his fur losing its glossy sheen while his behavior became increasingly erratic. Ron's worry about his pet's declining health was genuine, born from years of shared experiences, even if their relationship had never been particularly affectionate. The trip to Egypt that consumed the latter part of their summer was made possible by Arthur's unexpected windfall in the Daily Prophet's grand prize galleon draw, a stroke of luck that transformed the Weasley family's financial circumstances temporarily but memorably. For Ron, who had spent his entire life conscious of his family's poverty, the sudden abundance of gold was almost overwhelming in its possibilities. The photographs that appeared in the Prophet, showing the entire family posed before ancient pyramids, became treasured mementos of a time when they could afford to travel like wealthy wizards. Egypt itself was a revelation for Ron, whose understanding of the magical world had been largely confined to Britain and its particular traditions. The curse-breaking work that Bill performed in the ancient tombs required skills and knowledge that went far beyond anything taught at Hogwarts, revealing layers of magical practice that had been refined over millennia. Ron's pride in his eldest brother's expertise was mixed with awe at the complexity of magic that existed beyond their familiar boundaries. The shopping expedition to Diagon Alley that marked the end of summer brought the trio back together. After months of separation, their reunion marked by the easy familiarity of friends who had shared life-threatening adventures and emerged stronger for the experience. But even their joy at being reunited was overshadowed by new complications that would define their third year in ways none of them could anticipate. Hermione's purchase of Crookshanks, the enormous orange cat whose hunting instincts were immediately focused on Scabbers, created a source of tension that would strain their friendship for months to come. Ron's protective instincts regarding his ailing pet were entirely understandable, given Scabbers' obvious vulnerability and Crookshanks' obvious predatory intentions. The cat's persistent stalking of the rat created an atmosphere of constant vigilance in their shared spaces, with Ron never knowing when he might find Crookshanks lurking near Scabbers' cage with unmistakably hostile intent. The stress of protecting his pet while maintaining friendships with both Harry and Hermione tested Ron's diplomatic skills in ways that his straightforward nature found deeply challenging. The revelation of Sirius Black's escape from Azkaban cast a shadow over what should have been an exciting return to Hogwarts, introducing elements of genuine danger that went far beyond the academic challenges and social complications that typically marked the beginning of term. The knowledge that a convicted murderer with apparent connections to Harry was somewhere in the Scottish Highlands created an atmosphere of tension that affected every aspect of school life, from increased security measures to whispered conversations about past tragedies and future threats. Ron's understanding of Sirius Black's crimes was filtered through his family's deep connections to the wizarding community's collective memory. Stories passed down through dinner table conversations and overheard discussions that painted a picture of betrayal that cut to the heart of everything the Weasleys valued most. The idea that someone could betray their closest friends to the darkest wizard of the age was almost incomprehensible to Ron, whose loyalty was perhaps his defining characteristic. The Dementor attack on the Hogwarts Express provided Ron with his first direct encounter with creatures that embodied despair in its purest form, magical beings that drained happiness and hope from everything in their vicinity. The effect of their presence on the train compartment was immediate and overwhelming, dropping the temperature while filling the air with the kind of cold that seemed to seep into souls rather than merely chilling flesh. Ron's experience under the Dementor's influence revealed memories and emotions that he rarely allowed to surface, fears about inadequacy and abandonment that normally remained buried beneath his cheerful exterior. Harry's dramatic reaction to the Dementor's presence, collapsing completely while Ron and Hermione remained conscious though deeply affected, provided another reminder of how different their friends' experiences had been from their own relatively sheltered childhoods. The knowledge that Harry had witnessed his parents' murder as an infant was academic until moments like these revealed the lasting trauma that such experiences created, damage that couldn't be healed through simple friendship or good intentions. Professor Lupin's intervention during the Dementor attack and his subsequent care for Harry demonstrated teaching skills that went far beyond academic instruction, showing genuine concern for student welfare that had been notably absent from their previous defense against the dark arts instructors. Ron's initial wariness of yet another teacher in this cursed position gradually gave way to respect and admiration, as Lupin proved himself to be both competent and caring, someone who understood that learning required emotional safety as well as intellectual challenge. The introduction of divination as a subject proved to be a source of both entertainment and frustration for Ron, whose practical nature rebelled against Professor Trelawney's ethereal approach to magical education. The crystal gazing and tea leaf reading that comprised much of their classwork seemed less like genuine magic than elaborate games of imagination, though Ron's natural politeness prevented him from expressing his skepticism as openly as Hermione did. His predictions during practical sessions were well-meaning but obviously improvised, drawing on common sense rather than mystical insight to interpret the various symbols and signs that appeared in their divination tools. The ongoing tension between Hermione and Ron over their pet's mutual antagonism created an undercurrent of stress that affected all three friends, forcing Harry into the uncomfortable position of mediator in disputes that seemed to have no satisfactory resolution. Ron's increasingly desperate attempts to protect Scabbers from Crookshanks' hunting instincts led to elaborate defensive measures that consumed time and energy that might have been better spent on academic pursuits or social activities. The mysterious gift of the firebolt broomstick that arrived for Harry at Christmas created a new source of conflict between Ron and Hermione, as her decision to report the potentially dangerous gift to Professor McGonagall struck Ron as an unforgivable betrayal of their friend's trust. His anger at what he saw as her interference in Harry's personal business was compounded by his own envy of the magnificent racing broom, which represented a level of luxury that the Weasley family could never hope to afford. The temporary estrangement that followed the firebolt incident was particularly painful for Ron, who found himself caught between his loyalty to Harry and his growing frustration with Hermione's increasingly judgmental behavior. The magical examination of the broomstick that revealed no dangerous enchantments should have resolved their conflict, but by then the damage to their relationships had been compounded by the apparent death of Scabbers, which Ron blamed entirely on Crookshanks' predatory nature. The discovery of blood and cat hair in his dormitory, along with Scabbers' disappearance, seemed to provide conclusive evidence that Crookshanks had finally succeeded in his hunting mission. Ron's grief over his pet's apparent death was intensified by anger at Hermione's seeming indifference to the tragedy. Her attempts to rationalize Crookshanks' behavior as natural feline instinct, striking him as callous dismissal of a loss that genuinely mattered to him. The weeks that followed were marked by a coldness between Ron and Hermione that made their shared classes and common room time deeply uncomfortable. Their previous easy friendship replaced by polite distance that fooled no one who knew them well. Harry's attempts to reconcile his two best friends were well-intentioned but ultimately ineffective, as both Ron and Hermione had legitimate grievances that couldn't be resolved through simple apologies or diplomatic compromise. The night that Sirius Black infiltrated Gryffindor Tower marked a turning point in Ron's understanding of the dangers that surrounded them at Hogwarts, transforming the escaped prisoner from abstract threat to immediate terror. Waking to find a stranger standing over his bed with a knife was the kind of experience that left lasting psychological scars, though Ron's initial reaction was more instinctive than strategic. His scream of alarm that awakened the entire house proved to be exactly the right response under the circumstances, though the aftermath left him shaken in ways that took days to process fully. The attention that Ron received following the break-in attempt was both gratifying and overwhelming, as his fellow Gryffindors hung on his every word, while he recounted the terrifying encounter with increasing dramatic embellishment. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, with details becoming more vivid and threatening with each repetition, until Ron himself began to believe some of the more colourful additions that emerged during multiple retellings. The revelation that Buckbeak the Hippogriff faced execution for injuring Draco Malfoy during their Care of Magical Creatures class provided Ron with a cause that engaged his sense of justice and his protective instincts toward innocent creatures caught in political machinations beyond their control. His research efforts in the library, undertaken with characteristic determination, if not natural scholarly ability, demonstrated his capacity for sustained effort when the stakes mattered to him personally. The hours that Ron spent poring over legal precedents and magical creature welfare regulations represented a side of his character that was rarely displayed in academic settings. His natural intelligence focused by genuine concern rather than external pressure to perform. The briefs and arguments that he helped prepare for Buckbeak's defense were thorough and well-reasoned, though ultimately ineffective against the political forces aligned against the innocent hippogriff. The night when everything came together in the Shrieking Shack began with the simple act of Scabbers biting Ron and escaping toward the Whomping Willow, an event that seemed like the final cruel twist in their pet-related drama. Ron's pursuit of his supposedly dead rat led him directly into the most dangerous situation he had yet encountered, as the enormous black dog that seized him by the leg and dragged him toward the abandoned building was far more than it appeared to be. The pain of being dragged across rough ground by a creature whose intentions were completely unknown was both physical and psychological, as Ron understood that he was utterly helpless to resist whatever fate awaited him in the Shrieking Shack. His broken leg made escape impossible even if the opportunity arose, leaving him dependent on his friend's rescue efforts while trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about recent events. The revelation that Sirius Black was an animagus who could transform into the dog form that had terrorized him was shocking enough, but the subsequent discovery that Scabbers was actually Peter Pettigrew in his rat animagus form completely overturned Ron's understanding of his own life history. The pet that had shared his room for years was revealed to be a grown wizard whose cowardice and betrayal had contributed to Harry's parents' deaths, a deception so profound that it made Ron question his ability to judge anyone or anything accurately. The confrontation in the Shrieking Shack that followed brought together threads of mystery and revelation that had been building throughout their third year, as Professor Lupin's arrival and transformation into his werewolf form added another layer of danger to an already desperate situation. Ron's injury prevented him from participating actively in the magical battles that erupted around him, forcing him to witness events that would haunt his dreams for months to come, while being unable to contribute meaningfully to their resolution. The time travel rescue mission that Harry and Hermione undertook while Ron lay unconscious in the hospital wing represented adventures that he experienced only through their subsequent descriptions, though the successful rescue of both Sirius Black and Buckbeak provided satisfying conclusions to storylines that had dominated their third year. Ron's exclusion from these final heroic acts was both medically necessary and symbolically significant, marking moments when his friends had to act without his support or participation. The recovery period that followed allowed Ron to process the year's revelations and their implications for his understanding of the adult wizarding world, particularly the ways that appearances could be deceiving and that justice was not always achieved through official channels. The knowledge that an innocent man had spent 12 years in Azkaban while his betrayer lived in comfort and safety revealed flaws in the magical legal system that were disturbing for someone raised to respect authority and institutional wisdom. Sirius's gift of Pigwidgeon, the tiny owl whose enthusiasm far exceeded his practical utility, represented both compensation for the loss of Scabbers and acknowledgement of Ron's role in uncovering the truth about past betrayals. The owl's hyperactive nature and diminutive size made him less than ideal for carrying correspondence, but his obvious devotion to Ron created a bond that was based on genuine affection rather than mere convenience. The name that Ginny bestowed upon the owl, despite Ron's objections, became another source of mild embarrassment, as Pigwidgeon struck him as insufficiently dignified for a proper wizard's familiar. His attempts to rename the creature proved futile when it became clear that the owl would only respond to its original designation, forcing Ron to accept that sometimes identity was determined by others rather than self-chosen. The summer that followed their third year was marked by anticipation of the Quidditch World Cup, an event that represented the pinnacle of magical sporting achievement and provided Ron with the opportunity to witness his heroes in action. The camping experience that preceded the cup final was revelatory for someone whose previous travel had been limited to family visits and school transportation, showing him aspects of wizarding culture that existed beyond the boundaries of his normal experience. The match itself lived up to every expectation that Ron had harbored, with flying and strategy that demonstrated why Quidditch was considered the greatest magical sport. Victor Kroom's performance as Seeker was particularly impressive to Ron, whose own Quidditch ambitions made him appreciate the skill and courage required to compete at such elite levels. The souvenirs that he purchased with his carefully saved pocket money became treasured mementos of a perfect day that represented everything he loved about magical sports. The Death Eater attack that followed the cup final provided Ron with his first direct encounter with the forces of darkness that had been defeated before his birth, but whose influence continued to shape the wizarding world in ways he was best only beginning to understand. The terror and chaos that erupted in the campground transformed celebration into nightmare, revealing that the peace of his childhood had been more fragile than he had ever realized. The appearance of the dark mark in the sky above the campground was a symbol that Ron recognized from his parents' hushed conversations and his brother's serious discussions, a sign that represented everything evil and destructive about the recent past. The knowledge that supporters of Voldemort were still active and willing to terrorize innocent families created an atmosphere of fear that would influence wizarding society for years to come. The introduction of the Triwizard tournament at Hogwarts should have been cause for pure excitement, bringing together students from different magical schools in friendly competition that celebrated international cooperation and magical achievement. Ron's dreams of entering the tournament himself reflected his desire to prove himself worthy of recognition, to step out of the shadows cast by more accomplished siblings and friends, and achieve something that would be remembered for its own merits. The selection of Harry Potter as an unexpected fourth champion created a crisis in Ron's friendship that revealed insecurities and resentments that had been building for years beneath the surface of their easy companionship. The knowledge that his best friend had somehow entered the tournament without sharing his intentions felt like betrayal of the trust and openness that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Ron's anger at what he perceived as Harry's deception was compounded by jealousy that Harry had achieved the recognition and opportunity that Ron himself desperately wanted, the chance to prove himself through magical skill and courage, rather than merely supporting others' achievements. The weeks of estrangement that followed were painful for both boys, as they struggled to maintain normal social interactions while dealing with feelings that neither fully understood nor knew how to resolve. The first task of the tournament, which required champions to face dragons in single combat, provided Ron with stark evidence of the dangers that Harry was facing and the courage required to compete at such levels. His reconciliation with Harry following this demonstration of genuine peril was immediate and wholehearted. His anger dissolved by concern for his friend's safety and admiration for his performance under impossible pressure. The announcement of the Yule Ball as part of the tournament's traditional festivities introduced social complications that Ron found far more challenging than any academic subject or magical creature. The prospect of finding a date for the formal dance created anxiety that was entirely new to his experience, as his previous interactions with girls had been limited to family members and the female students who shared his classes and common room. Ron's last-minute invitation to Hermione revealed his complete inexperience with romantic relationships and social conventions. His assumption that she would be available as a backup option, demonstrating how thoroughly he had failed to notice that she had grown from annoying know-it-all into an attractive young woman whose company was sought by other boys. Her revelation that she already had a date struck him as impossible. His understanding of her social life, apparently incomplete, despite years of close friendship. The disaster of asking Fleur Delacour to accompany him to the ball represented Ron's first real attempt at approaching someone he found genuinely attractive, though his method revealed complete ignorance of how to conduct such interactions successfully. The combination of Fleur's Vila heritage, which made her irresistibly attractive to most males, and Ron's complete lack of experience with such situations created a perfect storm of embarrassment that would haunt him for months. The ball itself became an exercise in social torture for Ron, as he watched Hermione transformed into elegant beauty while accompanied by Victor Crumb, the international Quidditch star, whose athletic achievements and sophisticated manner made Ron feel like a provincial child by comparison. His evening was spent in alternating waves of jealousy, self-pity, and confused anger at circumstances that seemed designed to highlight his inadequacies. The argument that erupted between Ron and Hermione after the ball revealed feelings that had been developing gradually over years of friendship, emotions that neither had been prepared to acknowledge or address directly. Ron's accusation that she was fraternizing with the enemy reflected his territorial feelings about their friendship group, as well as his growing awareness that his feelings for her went beyond simple friendship. The second task of the tournament, which required champions to rescue something precious from the lake's depths, provided Ron with unwelcome insight into how others perceived his importance in Harry's life. His role as the treasure that Harry was required to retrieve was both flattering and disturbing, confirmation that their friendship was recognized by others as genuine, but also evidence that he was seen primarily in terms of his relationship to the more famous boy. The underwater experience itself was deeply unpleasant, even though Ron was magically unconscious throughout his time beneath the lake's surface. The knowledge that he had been used as bait in a magical contest without his explicit consent created uncomfortable questions about the ethics of the tournament and the extent to which students could be subjected to danger without their full understanding or agreement. The third task, which took place in a magical maze filled with dangerous creatures and obstacles, provided the most direct demonstration yet of the mortal peril that tournament champions faced in their pursuit of glory and recognition. Ron's position as spectator outside the maze made the waiting particularly difficult, as he could hear sounds of conflict and distress without being able to see what was happening or offer any assistance to his friend. Harry's return from the maze carrying Cedric Diggory's lifeless body marked the end of Ron's childhood innocence about the nature of evil and the reality of death in their world. The sight of a fellow Hogwarts student who had been murdered by the resurrected Voldemort provided undeniable proof that the dark forces which had shaped the previous generation were once again active and dangerous. The knowledge that Voldemort had returned, though officially denied by the Ministry of Magic, created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that would define the remainder of their time at Hogwarts. Ron's understanding of history and his family's experiences during the previous war made him appreciate the full implications of this development more clearly than many of his classmates, who were still protected by official reassurances and institutional denial. The summer that followed the tournament was marked by enforced separation from Harry and official silence about the events they had witnessed, as adult wizards attempted to control information that they deemed too dangerous for public consumption. Ron's frustration at being kept in the dark about Order of the Phoenix activities reflected his growing awareness that he was considered old enough to face dangers, but too young to participate in decisions about how those dangers should be addressed. The reunion with Harry at Grimmauld Place provided both relief and new sources of tension, as Ron struggled with feelings of guilt about having been safe with his family, while his best friend endured isolation and emotional abuse from his Muggle relatives. The knowledge that both he and Hermione had been living at Order headquarters while Harry remained ignorant of their activities created awkward dynamics that would take time to resolve fully. The development of his feelings for Hermione during this period was gradual and largely unconscious, emerging from years of friendship and shared experiences rather than sudden romantic revelation. His jealousy over her correspondence with Victor Krum revealed emotions that he himself didn't fully understand, protective and possessive feelings that went beyond normal friendship but which he lacked the experience or vocabulary to identify accurately. As Ron approached his 5th year at Hogwarts, he was beginning to understand that the comfortable certainties of childhood were giving way to adult complexities that would test his courage, loyalty, and character in ways that no academic subject or magical creature ever could. The boy who had once worried primarily about living up to his brother's achievements was evolving into a young man whose choices would help determine the fate of the wizarding world itself. The owl that arrived at the Burrow on a humid August morning carried news that transformed Ron Weasley from disappointed observer to reluctant participant in the grand machinery of Hogwarts administration. The prefect badge that tumbled from the official envelope gleamed with fresh authority against the breakfast table's worn wood, its silver surface reflecting morning sunlight in ways that seemed almost magical beyond its actual enchantments. Ron stared at the badge for several long moments, unable to process that such recognition had come to him rather than to Harry, who seemed the natural choice for any honor that Hogwarts might bestow upon their year. The family's reaction was immediate and overwhelming, with Molly's shriek of joy carrying across the Burrow's crooked corridors, while Arthur beamed with pride that made his usually mild features glow with parental satisfaction. Fred and George's shock was perhaps the most genuine response, their mouths hanging open in theatrical disbelief as they processed the reality that their academically unremarkable brother had been chosen for a position of responsibility that required both magical competence and mature judgment. The new Cleanse Sweep 11 broomstick that arrived later that day as reward for his appointment represented luxury beyond anything Ron had ever owned, its sleek lines and responsive handling making his previous flying experiences seem primitive by comparison. The knowledge that his parents had stretched their finances to purchase this gift intensified both his gratitude and his sense of obligation to prove worthy of their investment in his success. Harry's absence from the prefect list created an awkward dynamic that Ron struggled to navigate, his joy at receiving recognition tempered by awareness that his best friend had been passed over despite achievements that far exceeded anything Ron had accomplished. The guilt that accompanied his appointment was compounded by relief that he had finally received something that was his alone, not shared or overshadowed by Harry's more dramatic accomplishments. The return to Hogwarts marked by his new authority felt strange and wonderful, the prefect badge on his robes creating subtle changes in how other students interacted with him. First years, who might previously have ignored him now, sought his guidance, while older students who had dismissed him as Harry Potter's sidekick began treating him as an individual worthy of respect in his own right. The patrol duties that came with his position provided structure and purpose that he found surprisingly satisfying. Defense against the dark arts under Professor Umbridge introduced Ron to his first experience of institutionalized educational incompetence, as the ministry-appointed instructor made clear her intention to teach theory divorced from practical application. Her pink cardigans and saccharine smile concealed an authoritarian nature that brooked no dissent from official policy, creating classroom environments that were both stifling and educationally worthless. Ron's participation in the formation of Dumbledore's army represented rebellion that went against every instinct toward rule-following that his prefect position was supposed to encourage, but the necessity of learning actual defensive magic overrode concerns about official protocols. The clandestine meetings in the Room of Requirement provided the kind of practical magical education that Umbridge's classes conspicuously failed to deliver, while fostering bonds between students who might otherwise never have worked together. The decision to try out for the Gryffindor Quidditch team as keeper was motivated by a mixture of ambition and opportunity, as Oliver Wood's graduation had left the position open for someone willing to face the pressure of protecting the goal hoops against increasingly sophisticated offensive strategies. Ron's natural understanding of Quidditch tactics, gained through years of obsessive observation and family discussions, provided theoretical foundation for skills that would require extensive practice to develop into match-winning performance. The tryouts themselves were conducted under Harry's captaincy, a dynamic that created both advantages and complications for Ron's candidacy. Harry's intimate knowledge of Ron's character and abilities meant that he could see past obvious nervousness to underlying potential, but it also meant that accusations of favoritism would inevitably follow if Ron earned the position. The competition from Cormac McLagan was particularly intense, as the older student possessed both natural talent and aggressive confidence that made him seem like the obvious choice. Ron's successful selection as keeper represented validation of potential that had been developing for years beneath the surface of his more obvious limitations. Proof that patient observation and genuine passion could overcome lack of natural gifts or extensive training. But the victory was immediately complicated by Draco Malfoy's psychological warfare campaign, designed to undermine his confidence through public humiliation and constant reminders of his inadequacy. The song that Slytherin students created to torment him during matches became a form of musical torture that followed him through corridors and common rooms, its mocking lyrics embedding themselves in his consciousness until he could hear them even in moments of supposed safety. Weasley cannot save a thing, he cannot block a single ring, became a soundtrack to his worst fears about his own abilities, a prophecy of failure that seemed to fulfill itself through the sheer power of repetition. Hermione's kiss on his cheek before the crucial match against Slytherin was intended as encouragement, but had the opposite effect, stunning him into such distraction that his performance suffered even more dramatically than usual. The physical sensation of her lips against his skin created emotional confusion that made concentration on Quidditch strategy nearly impossible, while the public nature of the gesture generated speculation and teasing that added social pressure to his already overwhelming athletic responsibilities. The match itself became an exercise in public humiliation, as Ron's nerves and distraction combined to produce goalkeeping that was spectacularly ineffective even by his own modest standards. 4 goals conceded in rapid succession created a deficit that even Harry's seeker skills couldn't overcome, though Gryffindor's eventual victory through capture of the Golden Snitch prevented complete disaster for both team and keeper. The aftermath of his poor performance was complicated by the brawl that erupted when Malfoy's taunting pushed Harry and the twins beyond their limits of self-control, resulting in lifetime Quidditch bans that left Ron as one of the few experienced players remaining on the team. His desire to resign in shame was overruled by necessity, as Gryffindor's depleted roster couldn't afford to lose any more players, regardless of their individual limitations. The increased responsibilities that followed his teammates' bans forced Ron to develop leadership skills that he hadn't known he possessed, taking charge of training sessions and tactical planning in ways that gradually built both his confidence and his competence. The younger players who joined the team looked to him for guidance despite his recent failures, creating pressure that was different from but no less intense than his previous performance anxiety. Arthur's attack by Voldemort's snake Nagini during Christmas holidays transformed family celebration into medical crisis as the Weasleys rushed to Mungo's hospital to maintain vigil beside their patriarch's hospital bed. The sight of his father weakened by dark magic that had been deliberately inflicted created new understanding for Ron about the stakes involved in the larger conflict that was developing around them. The visit to the hospital's closed ward revealed tragedies that had been hidden from public view, including Neville's parents, whose minds had been shattered by Death Eater torture during the previous war. The encounter with Frank and Alice Longbottom provided stark evidence of what defeat in magical warfare could mean. Not just death, but fates that might be considered worse than death for both victims and their families. Gilderoy Lockhart's continued residence in the hospital, his memory permanently damaged by Ron's broken wand during their second year, served as a reminder of how magical accidents could have lasting consequences that extended far beyond their immediate effects. The irony that their former defense teacher's condition was partly Ron's responsibility created uncomfortable awareness of how individual actions could have implications that lasted for years. The return to Hogwarts after the Christmas crisis was marked by renewed determination to prove himself worthy of the faith that others had placed in him, particularly regarding his Quidditch responsibilities. The next match, against Hufflepuff, lasted only 22 minutes but packed enough action and humiliation to last a lifetime, as Ron conceded 14 goals while his team struggled to maintain any semblance of defensive organization. The defeat that followed should have been crushing, and indeed Gryffindor lost by 10 points despite Ginny's successful capture of the Golden Snitch, but the mathematics of Quidditch competition meant that they had qualified for the Cup final despite Ron's goalkeeping disasters. The knowledge that his poor performance had been overcome by his sister's brilliance was both humbling and inspiring, demonstrating how team success could transcend individual limitations. The weeks of preparation for the Cup final were marked by intensive training that pushed Ron's abilities to their limits, while teammates and coaches struggled to rebuild his shattered confidence. Angelina Johnson's patient leadership and tactical wisdom helped him understand that goalkeeping was as much about positioning and anticipation as reflexes and athleticism, skills that could be developed through study and practice rather than natural talent alone. The psychological preparation was perhaps more important than the physical training, as Ron worked to overcome the mental barriers that had been created by months of failure and public mockery. The support of his teammates, who had witnessed his struggles firsthand and understood the courage required to continue playing despite repeated humiliation, provided foundation for the confidence that would be essential for success in the Cup final. The match itself represented the culmination of Ron's growth throughout the year, as he channeled his accumulated experience of failure into performance that was both tactically sound and emotionally satisfying. The saves that he made during crucial moments of the game demonstrated not just improved technique, but the kind of mental toughness that distinguished good players from great ones, the ability to perform when performance mattered most. The victory celebration that followed was perhaps the sweetest moment of Ron's Hogwarts career to that point, as his teammates carried him on their shoulders while the crowd sang the transformed version of "Weasley is Our King" that turned Slytherin mockery into Gryffindor triumph. The cup that he held aloft represented vindication of faith that had been maintained despite overwhelming evidence that such faith was misplaced, proof that persistence could overcome lack of natural gifts. The transformation of the Slytherin taunt into celebration song provided poetic justice that was particularly satisfying given the months of psychological torment that the original version had inflicted. The knowledge that his detractors were forced to witness his moment of triumph added sweetness to victory that went beyond simple, competitive satisfaction, validation that made all the previous humiliation seem worthwhile. The happiness that followed his Quidditch success was tinged with guilt when he learned that Harry and Hermione had missed the match while investigating mysteries related to Hagrid's absence and the ongoing threat posed by Voldemort's return. The knowledge that his friends had been facing genuine dangers while he was enjoying athletic triumph created uncomfortable awareness of how different their priorities had become. The OWL examinations that dominated the end of their 5th year represented academic challenges that were different from, but no less daunting than Quidditch pressure, testing knowledge and skills that had been accumulated over 5 years of magical education. Ron's preparation was thorough by his standards, but inadequate compared to students like Hermione, whose systematic approach to learning had created knowledge bases that seemed almost encyclopedic in their comprehensiveness. The practical examinations were particularly nerve-wracking, as students were required to demonstrate spellcasting abilities under observation by examiners who were looking for both technical competence and creative application of magical principles. Ron's performance was generally solid, though unspectacular, reflecting his steady development as a wizard without suggesting exceptional talent or innovative thinking. The divination examination provided opportunity for both humor and embarrassment, as Ron's crystal ball reading revealed more about the examiner's appearance than about mystical insights into past or future events. His detailed description of the ugly man with a wart on his nose demonstrated observational skills, while completely missing the point of divinatory practice, earning marks for accuracy, if not for magical sensitivity. The Department of Mysteries expedition that concluded their 5th year represented the most dangerous adventure that Ron had yet undertaken, as the trio plus Neville, Luna, and Ginny ventured into restricted areas of the Ministry of Magic based on Harry's vision of Sirius Black in mortal danger. The decision to participate in this mission, despite his prefect responsibilities, demonstrated loyalty that transcended official duties, commitment to friendship that was stronger than institutional authority. The battle with Death Eaters that erupted in the department's various chambers provided Ron with his first direct experience of the kind of magical combat that had defined the previous war. Spells cast with lethal intent by opponents who viewed teenagers as legitimate targets rather than children to be protected. The intensity of the conflict was overwhelming for someone whose previous combat experience had been limited to schoolyard disagreements and Quidditch matches. The spell that struck Ron during the fighting affected his mind in ways that were both frightening and liberating, creating a state of consciousness that was simultaneously detached from reality and hyper-aware of immediate surroundings. His interaction with the brain specimen while under this influence demonstrated how magical artifacts could be dangerous in ways that weren't immediately obvious, their effects extending beyond simple physical damage to psychological and neurological systems. The tentacles that wrapped around Ron when he summoned the brain created injuries that were both visible and hidden, physical wounds that would heal relatively quickly, and psychological trauma that would influence his relationship with magic for years to come. The knowledge that his own curiosity and altered judgment had created these dangers provided uncomfortable lessons about the importance of maintaining mental clarity during crisis situations. The recovery period that followed the Department of Mysteries battle allowed Ron to process the year's events and their implications for his understanding of himself and his place in the larger conflict that was developing around them. The recognition that he had participated in genuine warfare rather than schoolboy adventures marked another step in his transition from childhood to adult responsibilities, understanding that choices now carried consequences that extended far beyond personal success or failure. Sirius Black's death during the battle created grief that was complicated by guilt, as Ron struggled with the knowledge that their rescue mission had been based on false information and that their godfather's death was partly the result of their decision to act without adult guidance or adequate preparation. The loss of Harry's only remaining family connection intensified Ron's protective instincts toward his best friend, while deepening his own appreciation for the family bonds that he sometimes took for granted. The end of their 5th year was marked by understanding that their childhood was definitively over, that the challenges they would face in coming years would be adult in their complexity and consequences. Ron's development during this crucial year had transformed him from insecure boy seeking recognition into young man capable of both leadership and sacrifice, someone whose loyalty and courage had been tested under conditions that revealed the true strength of his character. The prefect badge that had seemed like such an honor at the year's beginning now felt like symbol of responsibilities that extended far beyond school regulations, representing trust that others had placed in his judgment and character. The knowledge that he had proven worthy of such trust, despite failures and setbacks that had sometimes seemed overwhelming, provided foundation for confidence that would be essential in the trials that lay ahead. The summer that followed would bring new challenges and opportunities, as the wizarding world struggled to acknowledge the reality of Voldemort's return and prepare for conflicts that would test every bond of friendship, family, and community. Ron's experiences during his 5th year had prepared him for these larger battles by teaching him that victory often required persistence through failure, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear, and that the most important achievements were often invisible to outside observers, but transformative for those who experienced them directly. The boy who had once worried primarily about living up to his brother's accomplishments had evolved into someone whose own achievements created standards that others would struggle to match. Though this transformation remained largely invisible to Ron himself, his greatest strength continued to be his loyalty to friends and family. But this loyalty was now supported by competence and confidence that made him a formidable ally and a dangerous enemy to those who threatened what he valued most. The September air that carried Ron Weasley into his 6th year at Hogwarts was thick with anticipation and unspoken tensions that seemed to permeate every stone of the ancient castle, creating an atmosphere where normal teenage concerns about grades and Quidditch collided with increasingly urgent whispers about war and the return of forces that most students had hoped never to encounter. Ron stood on the threshold of 17, no longer the awkward boy who had stumbled through his first years, but not yet the man he would need to become, caught in that peculiar suspended moment of adolescence where everything felt both incredibly important and utterly trivial simultaneously. The exclusion from Professor Slughorn's Slug Club struck Ron as yet another reminder of his tendency to exist in the shadows of more accomplished friends. His invitation apparently lost in the mail while Harry, Hermione, and even Ginny found themselves welcomed into the exclusive circle of students whom the new potions master deemed worthy of cultivation. The rejection stung more than he cared to admit, touching on insecurities that had been developing since childhood about his value compared to those around him who seemed to possess natural talents or interesting connections that opened doors which remained firmly closed to him. Slughorn's criteria for membership seemed to favor either exceptional ability or family connections that might prove useful in advancing his own interests. Standards that made Ron's exclusion feel like judgment on both his magical competence and his family's modest position in wizarding society. The knowledge that his brothers Bill and Charlie might have earned invitations based on their professional achievements only emphasized how his own accomplishments paled by comparison, leaving him to wonder what unique contribution he might ever make that would justify recognition in his own right. The romantic tensions that had been building between Ron and Hermione for years began to surface more obviously during their 6th year, creating an undercurrent of awkwardness that affected all their interactions, while neither seemed capable of addressing the situation directly. Their conversations became minefields where casual comments could trigger emotional explosions, while their attempts to maintain normal friendship patterns were complicated by physical awareness and jealousy that neither fully understood nor knew how to manage constructively. The revelation that Hermione had kissed Victor Krum during their correspondence-based friendship struck Ron like a physical blow, transforming his vague suspicions about their relationship into concrete knowledge that his worst fears about being inadequate compared to more sophisticated rivals were entirely justified. The mental image of Hermione in the arms of an international Quidditch star and war hero created feelings of inadequacy and rage that he struggled to process rationally, leading to behavior that was petty and hurtful, even by his own standards. His decision to pursue a relationship with Lavender Brown was motivated more by desire to make Hermione jealous than genuine attraction to Lavender herself, a calculation that was both strategically obvious and emotionally damaging to everyone involved. Lavender's infatuation with him was genuine and wholehearted, making his manipulation of her feelings particularly cruel even though he seemed largely unconscious of the pain he was causing through his selfishness. The relationship with Lavender began as post-Quidditch celebration, his successful performance against Slytherin, creating euphoria that translated into physical affection with the first willing partner available, rather than expression of deep emotional connection. The kiss that sealed their relationship was public and dramatic, designed as much for Hermione's observation as for his own satisfaction, achieving its intended effect of causing obvious pain while creating complications that he hadn't fully anticipated. Lavender's approach to romance was enthusiastic to the point of suffocation, her constant attention and physical demonstrativeness, making Ron feel trapped in ways that he couldn't articulate without seeming ungrateful or cruel. Her pet names and public displays of affection embarrassed him, while her assumption that their relationship was more serious than he intended created pressure that intensified his desire to escape circumstances of his own creation. The necklace that Lavender gave him for Christmas, emblazoned with "My Sweetheart" in letters that seemed designed for maximum visibility, represented everything that made him uncomfortable about their relationship, while highlighting his inability to communicate honestly about his feelings and intentions. Wearing the jewelry felt like advertising false emotions, while removing it would require confrontations that his conflict-avoidant nature desperately wanted to postpone. Hermione's response to his relationship with Lavender revealed the depth of her own feelings, while demonstrating her capacity for subtle revenge that was perhaps more effective than direct confrontation would have been. The flock of canaries that she set upon him after witnessing his romantic displays provided both immediate physical discomfort and public humiliation that made clear her emotional investment in his romantic choices, though neither of them was ready to acknowledge what such reactions implied about their underlying relationship. The invitation of Cormac McLaggen to Slughorn's Christmas party was calculated to cause maximum jealousy, while maintaining plausible deniability about her motivations, demonstrating that Hermione was capable of playing romantic games with the same strategic thinking that she applied to academic challenges. Ron's reaction to seeing her with McLaggen was everything she had hoped for, and more. His obvious distress providing satisfaction that was probably temporary, but nonetheless deeply gratifying in the moment. The poisoning incident that nearly cost Ron his life on his 17th birthday transformed romantic complications into matters of genuine life and death, as the love potion intended for Harry led to consumption of mead that had been tampered with by enemies whose sophistication exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The chocolate cauldrons from Romilda Vane that triggered the crisis were innocent in themselves, but became vehicles for attempted murder through their connection to a plot whose complexity suggested careful planning and intimate knowledge of Hogwarts routines. Harry's quick thinking in taking Ron to Professor Slughorn for treatment of the love potion effects inadvertently saved his life when the celebratory drink that followed turned out to contain poison that would have been fatal without immediate intervention. The bezoar that Harry remembered from their first-year potions lessons provided antidote to toxins that were specifically chosen to be undetectable and deadly, suggesting that their enemies understood both magical medicine and the psychological patterns that would lead targets into danger. Ron's near-death experience in the hospital wing provided clarity about relationships and priorities that had been obscured by teenage drama and social complications, as both Hermione and Lavender maintained vigils beside his bed while he drifted in and out of consciousness. The words he spoke while semi-conscious revealed emotions that he might never have articulated under normal circumstances, calling Hermione's name with longing that made his true feelings obvious to everyone present. Hermione's devotion during his recovery contrasted sharply with Lavender's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain claim on his attention, creating a situation where his preferences became clear even to casual observers. The jealousy that erupted between the two girls over visiting rights and romantic priority was both flattering and deeply uncomfortable, highlighting how his earlier attempts at manipulation had created genuine pain for people who deserved better treatment than his immaturity had provided. The confrontation between Hermione and Lavender in the boys' dormitory where Lavender discovered them emerging together while Harry remained hidden under his invisibility cloak, provided the catalyst for ending a relationship that had become burdensome for everyone involved. Lavender's accusations of infidelity were technically unfounded, but emotionally accurate, as Ron's heart had never truly been engaged in their romance despite his physical participation in its public displays. The breakup that followed was messy and painful, with Lavender's tears and accusations creating guilt that Ron would carry long after the immediate crisis passed. His inability to explain his behavior without revealing feelings for Hermione that he wasn't ready to acknowledge directly left him appearing callous and manipulative, accurately reflecting aspects of his conduct while failing to capture the confusion and immaturity that had motivated his poor choices. The relief that followed his return to single status was complicated by awareness that his treatment of Lavender had damaged his reputation among students who viewed his behavior as evidence of character flaws rather than teenage confusion. The whispered conversations that followed him through corridors included legitimate criticism of his romantic ethics, observations that stung because they contained enough truth to resist dismissal as mere gossip or jealousy. His 17th birthday marked not just legal adulthood in wizarding society, but eligibility for apparition lessons that represented another step toward independence and adult responsibilities. The ability to appear and disappear at will was perhaps the most significant magical skill that students could master, providing freedom of movement that transformed both practical possibilities and psychological relationship with space and distance. The apparition tests that followed the instructional period proved more challenging than Ron had anticipated, requiring concentration and visualization skills that didn't come naturally to his practical approach to magic. His failure to pass on the first attempt, leaving behind half an eyebrow in the process, was both embarrassing and educational, demonstrating that some forms of magic required patience and precision rather than the intuitive approaches that had served him well in other subjects. The second Quidditch Cup victory that Gryffindor achieved under Harry's captaincy provided redemption for Ron's earlier goalkeeping struggles, while establishing him as a legitimate athletic talent, rather than merely someone who filled a necessary position inadequately. His saves during crucial matches demonstrated growth in both technical skill and mental toughness, proving that persistence and proper coaching could overcome natural limitations and psychological barriers. The celebration that followed their cup victory was marked by Harry and Ginny's first kiss, a development that created complex emotions for Ron as he processed his best friend's romantic involvement with his only sister. The protective instincts that had been developing throughout Ginny's childhood collided with genuine friendship and loyalty to Harry, creating internal conflicts that required careful navigation to maintain relationships that mattered deeply to him. His acceptance of Harry and Ginny's relationship, while not without reservations and occasional awkwardness, demonstrated maturity that had been developing gradually throughout their years of friendship. The recognition that his sister was old enough to make her own romantic choices, and that Harry's character made him worthy of such trust, represented growth in Ron's understanding of family dynamics and personal autonomy. The Battle of the Astronomy Tower that concluded their 6th year brought war directly to Hogwarts in ways that made abstract concerns about Voldemort's return into immediate threats to people and places that Ron loved most. Bill's savage injuries at the hands of Greyback the werewolf provided stark evidence that the conflict they were entering would demand sacrifices that went far beyond academic achievement or athletic success, requiring courage and endurance that would test every bond of family and friendship. The sight of his eldest brother's face, torn by claws and teeth, was perhaps the most traumatic experience of Ron's life to that point, forcing him to confront the reality that war meant permanent damage to people he loved, rather than abstract battles between good and evil forces. Bill's acceptance of his disfigurement and Fleur's unchanged devotion to him, despite his altered appearance, provided models for courage and love that would influence Ron's understanding of what truly mattered when everything else was stripped away. Dumbledore's death during the same night transformed grief into rage and determination as Ron processed the loss of the most powerful wizard of their age and the symbolic protection that his presence had provided. The funeral that followed brought together representatives of the entire wizarding community, creating opportunities for Ron to understand how many different people and groups would be affected by the war that was now inevitable. Harry's announcement that he would not be returning for 7th year at Hogwarts struck Ron like lightning, forcing him to choose between the educational path that his family expected and the loyalty to friends that had defined his character since childhood. The decision to abandon his studies in favor of joining Harry's hunt for Horcruxes was made without hesitation, though the implications of such a choice would not become fully clear until much later. The summer that followed 6th year was marked by preparation for adventures that none of them could fully imagine, as Ron tried to balance family obligations with commitment to a mission that he understood might well cost him his life. The knowledge that he was deliberately choosing danger over safety, uncertainty over comfort, adventure over conventional success, represented the final transformation from boy to man that had been developing throughout his years at Hogwarts. The young man who emerged from 6th year was fundamentally different from the insecure child who had boarded the Hogwarts Express for the first time 6 years earlier, though Ron himself remained largely unconscious of how completely he had been transformed by years of friendship, challenge, and growth. His loyalty remained his defining characteristic, but it was now supported by competence, courage, and self-knowledge that made him a formidable ally and a dangerous enemy to those who threatened what he valued most. The romantic complications that had dominated much of his 6th year were resolved in favor of deeper understanding about the difference between attraction and love, between possession and partnership, between the desire to be wanted and the willingness to commit to another person's happiness and growth. His feelings for Hermione had evolved from competitive jealousy to genuine affection based on years of shared experience and mutual respect, though neither of them was yet ready to risk their friendship by acknowledging the full extent of their emotional connection. As Ron prepared to leave Hogwarts behind, possibly forever, he carried with him not just magical knowledge and practical skills, but understanding of himself and his relationships that would prove essential in the trials ahead. The boy who had once worried about living up to his brother's achievements had become someone whose own accomplishments created standards that others would struggle to match, though this transformation remained largely invisible to Ron himself as he focused on the challenges that lay ahead rather than celebrating the victories he had already achieved. The summer of 1997 settled over the Burrow, like a shroud woven from equal parts anticipation and dread. Its warm days and gentle evenings marked by the constant awareness that this might be the last peaceful season any of them would know for years to come. Ron Weasley stood at the threshold of 17, legally an adult in wizarding society but feeling younger than ever as he contemplated the magnitude of the mission that lay ahead. The quest to find and destroy Horcruxes that would determine not just his own fate but the future of the entire magical world. The Battle of Seven Potters that marked Harry's departure from Privet Drive represented Ron's first direct participation in Order of the Phoenix operations, a transition from protected student to active combatant that carried weight beyond its immediate tactical implications. The Polyjuice potion that transformed him into Harry's exact physical duplicate felt like wearing someone else's skin, the borrowed appearance sitting uneasily on his consciousness, while his thoughts and personality remained entirely his own beneath the magical disguise. Tonks proved to be an ideal partner for the dangerous flight to Auntie Muriel's house. Her Auror training and combat experience providing expertise that complemented Ron's determination and natural flying ability. The Death Eaters who attacked their formation were more numerous and better organized than intelligence had suggested, revealing that Voldemort's forces had gained access to order plans through means that remained mysterious but deeply troubling. The aerial battle that erupted above suburban Little Whinging was unlike anything Ron had experienced during his years of Quidditch matches, where the worst consequences of poor performance were embarrassment and point deductions, rather than death or torture at the hands of enemies who viewed teenage decoys as legitimate military targets. The stunning spell that he cast at a pursuing Death Eater connected with satisfying force, sending his opponent tumbling from his broomstick toward the ground far below, though Ron felt no satisfaction at possibly causing serious injury to another human being. The failure to reach their assigned safe house on schedule forced an improvised return journey through skies that remained dangerous despite their successful completion of the initial mission, demonstrating how even carefully planned operations could be complicated by factors beyond anyone's control. The relief that flooded through Ron when they finally touched down safely at the Burrow was matched by anxiety about the fate of other teams whose outcomes remained unknown. Mad-Eye Moody's death during the battle struck the Order like a physical blow, removing one of their most experienced and capable members, while proving that even legendary auras were not invulnerable to the forces they faced. Ron's grief for the gruff veteran who had taught him so much about constant vigilance was complicated by guilt that his own survival had come at the cost of someone whose magical skills and tactical wisdom far exceeded his own limited abilities. The wedding of Bill and Fleur that followed provided brief respite from war preparations, creating an atmosphere of celebration that felt both precious and fragile given the circumstances that surrounded them. Ron's role as usher allowed him to observe the gathering of friends and family who might be seeing each other for the last time, their forced cheerfulness unable to entirely mask awareness that such gatherings were becoming increasingly rare and dangerous. Victor Krumm's presence at the wedding rekindled jealousy that Ron had thought he had overcome, particularly when the Bulgarian seeker's attention focused immediately on Hermione, despite her obvious lack of interest in renewing their acquaintance. The possessive feelings that surged through Ron were both irrational and powerful, making him act in ways that were petty and territorial, even though Hermione had given him no reason to doubt her loyalty or affection. The Death Eater attack that shattered the wedding celebration provided brutal demonstration that nowhere was truly safe from Voldemort's reach, not even locations protected by the most sophisticated magical defenses and surrounded by accomplished witches and wizards. Ron's quick thinking during the evacuation helped several guests escape immediate capture, though the knowledge that their enemies had penetrated so deeply into Order operations was profoundly disturbing. The escape to Grimmauld Place that followed the wedding attack marked the beginning of their life as fugitives, cut off from family support and institutional protection, while pursuing objectives that seemed increasingly impossible to achieve. The grim townhouse that served as their refuge was filled with reminders of the Black family's dark history, magical artifacts and portraits that reflected the pure-blood supremacist ideology they were fighting against. The discovery that Dolores Umbridge possessed Salazar Slytherin's locket, one of the Horcruxes they needed to destroy, provided their first concrete lead, while raising questions about how such a powerful dark object had come into Ministry possession. The planning required for their infiltration mission pushed Ron's strategic thinking abilities to new levels, as they developed covers and contingencies for an operation that would take them into the heart of wizarding government. The Polyjuice potion brewing that preceded their Ministry infiltration required ingredients and techniques that went beyond anything they had learned in formal potions classes, forcing them to rely on Hermione's theoretical knowledge and Ron's practical experience with his family's more unconventional magical practices. The transformation into Reg Catamol, a ministry maintenance worker, provided Ron with identity that was both anonymous and essential, allowing him access to restricted areas while avoiding the scrutiny that more prominent covers might attract. The ministry building that they entered was transformed from the impressive governmental complex Ron remembered into something approaching a fortress, its security measures enhanced by paranoia, and its atmosphere poisoned by the fear that permeated every interaction between employees who could no longer trust their colleagues or superiors. The propaganda posters that decorated the walls proclaimed the superiority of pure-blood wizards, while warning of the dangers posed by Muggle-born infiltrators, creating an environment where hatred had become official policy. The encounter with his father during their infiltration created one of the most emotionally challenging moments of Ron's young life, as he struggled to maintain his disguise while desperately wanting to reassure Arthur that his family was safe and that the resistance continued despite official claims of victory. The conversation they shared, with Arthur unknowingly speaking to his own son while both pretended to be other people entirely, highlighted the personal costs of the war that were often overshadowed by its larger strategic implications. The recovery of the locket from Umbridge's office required confronting the woman whose authoritarian rule at Hogwarts had made her one of the most despised figures in recent memory, now revealed as an active collaborator with forces that sought to destroy everything decent about magical society. Her casual cruelty toward Muggle-born defendants in the makeshift courtrooms was perhaps more disturbing than overt violence would have been, demonstrating how evil could flourish through bureaucratic channels as effectively as through military conquest. The escape from the ministry that followed their successful theft was complicated by Yaxley's last-second grab, which compromised their planned retreat to Grimmauld Place and forced them to seek refuge in the wilderness with limited supplies and no clear destination. The splinching injury that Ron suffered during their hasty departure left part of his arm behind in London, creating wounds that were both immediately painful and symbolically significant, as evidence of the prices they were paying for their mission. The camping existence that defined their autumn months tested every aspect of their friendship and individual character, as hunger, uncertainty, and the Horcrux's malevolent influence combined to create stress that pushed all of them beyond their normal limits of patience and cooperation. The tent that provided their shelter was magically expanded, but still confined, creating living conditions that would have been challenging even without the emotional tensions that developed between them. The locket Horcrux that they took turns wearing affected Ron more severely than either Harry or Hermione, its dark magic seeming to find purchase in his existing insecurities and magnifying them until they became overwhelming obsessions. The whispers of inadequacy that had always lurked at the edges of his consciousness became roaring accusations that he was useless, unwanted, and fundamentally inferior to the friends whose achievements overshadowed his own modest contributions. The wireless radio that Ron monitored obsessively provided their only connection to the larger world they had left behind, its broadcasts mixing genuine news with propaganda in ways that made determining truth from fiction increasingly difficult. The programs that tracked missing persons and reported Death Eater activities created mounting anxiety about the fate of family and friends, while providing no means to offer assistance or even confirm their safety. The gradual deterioration of Ron's relationship with Harry was perhaps inevitable given the stresses they faced, but the specific triggers that led to their final confrontation revealed fault lines in their friendship that had been developing for years beneath the surface of their apparent compatibility. The accusation that Harry didn't truly understand the sacrifices others were making for him contained enough truth to sting, even though it ignored the enormous burdens that Harry carried in return. The argument that preceded Ron's departure was both deeply personal and fundamentally about larger issues of leadership, sacrifice, and the different ways that people processed fear and uncertainty. Harry's frustration with Ron's complaints about their living conditions and mission progress reflected his own desperate need to believe that their quest was meaningful, while Ron's anger stemmed from genuine concern about family safety and growing doubts about their chances of success. The decision to leave was made in anger and regret almost immediately, but the Horcrux's influence combined with wounded pride to prevent Ron from returning immediately to friends who might not welcome him back after his betrayal of their shared mission. The Snatchers who intercepted his attempted return to Harry and Hermione provided concrete evidence of the dangers that surrounded anyone who opposed the new regime. Their casual brutality and obvious competence, highlighting how much the tactical situation had deteriorated since their mission began. The false identity as Stan Shumpike that Ron provided during his interrogation was inspired improvisation that relied on his knowledge of Wizarding Society's lower classes, people whose names might appear in ministry records but whose faces were not well known to the enforcement squads. The escape that followed required both luck and quick thinking, as Ron used the Snatcher's momentary distraction to disapparate away from certain capture and probable torture. The weeks that followed his escape were perhaps the lowest point in Ron's life, as he wandered through a landscape that seemed increasingly hostile, while struggling with guilt about abandoning his friends and shame about his inability to find them again. The repeated attempts to locate Harry and Hermione through Apparition resulted in nothing but frustration and occasional injury, as his desperation led him to take risks with his already damaged magical abilities. Shell Cottage, where Bill and Fleur had established their new home, provided temporary refuge, but also forced Ron to confront family members who had every right to be disappointed in his choices. The explanation he provided for his separation from Harry and Hermione was necessarily incomplete, as he could not reveal details about their mission without compromising security that might already have been breached through his capture and escape. The Deluminator that Dumbledore had bequeathed to him proved to be far more than a simple light-controlling device, its magic attuned to his emotional connections in ways that seemed almost sentient. The voices of Harry and Hermione that he heard through the device during their moments of greatest emotional intensity provided both comfort and torment, confirming that they continued their mission while highlighting his absence from their shared struggles. The guidance that the Deluminator provided when he finally worked up courage to use it as intended was both magical and deeply personal, leading him not just to his friend's location, but to the moment when they needed him most desperately. The sight of Harry struggling beneath the ice of a frozen pond created clarity about priorities that had been obscured by months of doubt and recrimination, transforming his return from shameful retreat into heroic rescue. The destruction of the Locket Horcrux that Ron accomplished with the Sword of Gryffindor was both deeply satisfying and profoundly traumatic, as the dark magic within the object fought back with visions designed to exploit his deepest fears and insecurities. The images of Harry and Hermione expressing their contempt for his inadequacy were crafted to cause maximum psychological damage, but Ron's growth during their separation allowed him to recognize them as lies, even as they tore at his heart. The reunion with Harry and Hermione that followed was complicated by emotions that none of them were entirely prepared to process, as relief at being together again mixed with hurt feelings and unresolved tensions from their separation. Hermione's fury at Ron's abandonment was entirely justified and needed to be expressed, while her eventual forgiveness reflected understanding that their mission was more important than personal grievances, however legitimate. The information that Ron provided about conditions in the wider wizarding world helped his friends understand how completely the war had shifted in Voldemort's favor during their absence, with resistance movements either destroyed or driven deep underground, while collaborators consolidated control over every aspect of magical society. The taboo that made speaking Voldemort's name a tracking mechanism represented a level of magical sophistication that suggested their enemies possessed capabilities that the Order had not anticipated. The visit to Xenophilius Lovegood's house in search of information about the Deathly Hallows nearly resulted in their capture, when Luna's father revealed that his daughter was being held hostage to ensure his cooperation with ministry authorities. The battle that erupted in the collapsing house demonstrated how desperation could drive even good people to betray their principles, while their narrow escape highlighted the increasing dangers they faced as their enemies grew more sophisticated and desperate. The capture by snatchers that resulted from Harry's inadvertent use of the taboo represented perhaps the most terrifying experience of Ron's life to that point, as they found themselves at the mercy of bounty hunters whose casual cruelty was matched only by their greed for the rewards that prominent prisoners would bring. The decision to hide his identity behind swelling jinxes was quick thinking that potentially saved his life, though the physical discomfort was considerable. Malfoy Manor, where they were taken for identification and interrogation, represented everything that was wrong with Wizarding Society's traditional power structures. Its elegant facade, concealing chambers designed for torture and murder, the separation that forced Ron and Harry into the cellar while Hermione faced Bellatrix Lestrange's interrogation above, created helplessness that was almost unbearable, listening to her screams while being unable to offer any assistance. The death of Peter Pettigrew in the cellar provided unexpected justice for past betrayals, while demonstrating the lethal consequences of serving masters who viewed their followers as expendable resources. The silver hand that Voldemort had given to replace the one Pettigrew had sacrificed turned against its owner when he showed momentary mercy, creating poetic justice that felt both satisfying and deeply disturbing. Dobby's sacrifice during their escape from Malfoy Manor represented loss of innocence in ways that went beyond their previous encounters with death, as the house elf's genuine goodness and selfless devotion contrasted sharply with the cruelty and selfishness they had witnessed from human characters on both sides of the conflict. The funeral they held for him on the beach near Shell Cottage was both memorial service and commitment ceremony, as they renewed their dedication to completing their mission regardless of personal cost. The revelation that their true identities were now known to their enemies transformed their situation from dangerous to desperate, as the protection that anonymity had provided was stripped away by their capture and escape. The knowledge that Ron's family would now face increased scrutiny and probable persecution for his activities created guilt that was almost overwhelming, though there was no way to provide warning without risking their own capture. The plan to break into Gringotts Bank represented their most ambitious operation yet, requiring not just magical skill and careful planning, but willingness to risk everything on a single, desperate gambit. The transformation magic that disguised Ron as a random wizard was less sophisticated than their previous polyjuice efforts, but adequate for their purposes given the chaos and confusion they intended to create. The dragon that guarded the Lestrange's vault proved to be both obstacle and opportunity, its long imprisonment having broken its spirit while leaving its physical power intact. The ride that followed their successful theft was perhaps the most exhilarating and terrifying experience of Ron's life, soaring through the London sky on the back of a creature whose cooperation was temporary and whose landing preferences remained unknown. The return to Hogwarts that concluded their quest brought them full circle to the place where their friendship had begun, though the castle they found was transformed by months of Death Eater control into something approaching a prison. The secret passages and hidden rooms that had once provided venues for mischief and adventure now served as refuges for students who had been tortured for their defiance of the new regime. The Battle of Hogwarts that erupted upon their arrival represented the culmination of everything they had been working toward. As Ron finally had the opportunity to fight openly alongside family and friends rather than hiding in shadows or pursuing abstract objectives, the knowledge that this battle would determine the fate of everyone he cared about provided clarity and determination that had been lacking during their months of uncertain wandering. As Ron prepared for what might be the final test of his courage and loyalty, he carried with him not just magical knowledge and combat experience, but understanding of himself and his relationships that had been forged through months of hardship and sacrifice. The boy who had once worried about living up to his brother's achievements had become someone whose own accomplishments would create legends that future generations would struggle to match, though this transformation remained largely invisible to Ron himself as he focused on the immediate challenges of survival and victory. The dragon that carried them away from the chaos of Gringotts Bank soared through London's grey morning sky with the desperate power of a creature that had known only darkness and chains for decades, its massive wings beating against air that tasted of freedom for the first time since its capture. Ron clung to the beast's scarred hide with hands that shook from more than just the cold wind rushing past them, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what they had accomplished and the even greater challenges that awaited them now, that their quest had brought them to its final, most dangerous phase. The descent toward the lake where the dragon finally chose to rest was both terrifying and oddly peaceful, as the creature's exhaustion mirrored their own weariness after months of running, hiding, and fighting battles that seemed to multiply with each small victory they achieved. The splash that marked their landing sent waves rippling across water that reflected the overcast sky like a mirror, creating momentary beauty in circumstances that were anything but beautiful. Harry's revelation that the final Horcrux lay hidden within Hogwarts itself transformed their abstract quest into concrete destination. The castle that had been their home for 6 years, now serving as the stage for what would inevitably be their ultimate confrontation with Voldemort, and everything he represented. The knowledge that they were finally approaching the end of their mission created a mixture of relief and terror. Understanding that success was now possible, but far from guaranteed. The journey to Hogsmeade through the gathering dusk was undertaken with the kind of desperate stealth that had become second nature during their months as fugitives, every shadow potentially concealing enemies while every sound might herald discovery and capture. The village that had once represented weekend freedom and butterbeer-flavoured happiness was now transformed into occupied territory, its familiar shops and houses serving as potential traps for anyone foolish enough to venture into Voldemort's expanding sphere of control. The encounter with Aberforth Dumbledore in the Hog's Head provided unexpected assistance from someone whose bitter wisdom had been earned through decades of watching his brother's grand schemes unfold, with consequences that extended far beyond their intended effects. His willingness to help them, despite his obvious skepticism about their chances of success, spoke to family loyalty that transcended political disagreement, though his warnings about the likely cost of their mission proved more prophetic than any of them were prepared to accept. The secret passage that led from Aberforth's pub directly into Hogwarts felt like travelling through time as well as space, carrying them from the uncertainty of their fugitive existence back into the familiar corridors where their friendships had been forged and their characters shaped through years of shared adventure and gradual growth. The room of requirement that served as their destination had been transformed into a refuge for students whose defiance of the Death Eater regime had made continued residence in the dormitories dangerous or impossible. The reunion with Neville, Luna, and other members of Dumbledore's army provided evidence of how much their former classmates had grown during the months of occupation, their faces bearing the marks of hardship and resistance, while their eyes held the kind of determination that came from choosing principles over safety. The stories they shared about life under the Carrow's brutal rule painted pictures of systematic cruelty, designed to break spirits, as well as bodies, transforming education into indoctrination and learning into an exercise in survival. The decision to involve their former classmates in the search for Ravenclaw's diadem created moral complications that Ron felt deeply, understanding that their mission would inevitably draw these brave young people into dangers that none of them were fully prepared to face. The knowledge that his choices would potentially cost lives among people he cared about weighed heavily on his conscience, though the alternative of abandoning their quest would certainly result in even greater casualties among innocent victims of Voldemort's expanding tyranny. Luna's insights about her house's legendary artifact provided the crucial breakthrough they needed. Her offhand knowledge of Ravenclaw lore, revealing the diadem's likely location within the Room of Hidden Things, that vast repository of objects that generations of Hogwarts students had concealed within the castle's magical architecture. The irony that such an important dark object had been hidden in plain sight among countless other discarded items spoke to Voldemort's arrogance and his assumption that his cleverness exceeded everyone else's understanding. The journey into the Room of Hidden Things was like entering a museum of forgotten dreams and abandoned projects, towering piles of objects that told stories of lives lived and choices made within these ancient walls. The search for a single tiara among countless thousands of artifacts required patience and systematic effort that tested their ability to maintain focus, while understanding that every moment of delay increased the likelihood that their presence would be discovered and reported to authorities who would show no mercy to captured intruders. Ron's decision to accompany Hermione on their mission to the Chamber of Secrets represented perhaps the most terrifying journey of his life, as they descended into the depths of the castle to retrieve basilisk fangs that could destroy the remaining Horcruxes. The chamber that had nearly cost his sister's life during their second year felt even more ominous now, its ancient magic saturated with malevolence that seemed to recognize their intrusion and respond with almost sentient hostility. The basilisk's corpse, though years dead, remained a monument to the kind of dark magic that Voldemort had unleashed throughout his reign of terror, its massive skeleton serving as a reminder of the monsters that evil could create when given sufficient power and freedom to operate without moral constraints. The fangs that they harvested from its skull were weapons against darkness that had been created by darkness itself, tools forged through tragedy that would now serve to prevent even greater tragedies. Hermione's brilliant realization that house elves were likely trapped in the kitchens during the battle that was surely coming revealed the depth of her moral growth and her commitment to principles that went beyond simple opposition to Voldemort's rule. Her concern for the welfare of magical creatures who had been marginalized and exploited by wizarding society for centuries demonstrated understanding that true victory required more than military success, that lasting change demanded recognition of injustice in all its forms. The kiss that she gave Ron, in response to his immediate support for her concern about the house elves, was both spontaneous expression of years of accumulated affection and symbolic moment that marked their transition from childhood, friendship to adult partnership. The physical sensation was less important than the emotional significance, confirming feelings that had been developing for years, while providing hope that their relationship could survive whatever trials awaited them in the immediate future. The confrontation with Malfoy, Crabbe and Goyle in the Room of Hidden Things transformed their Horcrux hunt into life and death struggle, as former schoolmates who had chosen different sides in the war met in combat that was fueled by years of accumulated resentment and ideological conflict. The Fiendfyre that Crabbe unleashed in his desperation was perhaps the most dangerous magic any of them had encountered. Cursed flames that consumed everything in their path, while growing stronger with each object they devoured. The rescue of their enemies from the fire that would otherwise have killed them represented moral choice that defined the difference between their cause and Voldemort's philosophy, demonstrating that preserving life was more important than pursuing revenge even against those who had shown them no mercy. Ron's participation in this rescue, despite the obvious dangers involved, showed how completely he had internalized the values that made their fight worthwhile, choosing heroism over hatred, even when hatred would have been easier and safer. The escape from the burning room on broomsticks that barely outpaced the magical flames pursuing them was perhaps the most terrifying flight of Ron's life, as they navigated through smoke and supernatural fire, while carrying passengers whose weight made their already dangerous situation even more precarious. The destruction of the diadem Horcrux by the Fiendfyre provided bitter satisfaction, as Crabbe's murderous curse achieved their objective while costing him his own life through magical forces that he couldn't control or understand. The battle that erupted throughout Hogwarts as Voldemort's forces launched their final assault on the last bastion of organized resistance was unlike anything that had occurred within the castle's walls during its 1,000 years of history. Ancient stones echoing with sounds of combat, while protective enchantments that had endured for centuries were tested against dark magic of unprecedented power and malevolence. Ron found himself fighting alongside his brothers, his parents, and his friends in defense of everything that had made their lives worth living. The sight of his family united in common cause, despite their different personalities and life paths, created emotions that were almost overwhelming. Pride in their courage, mixing with terror that this might be the last time they would all be together. Percy's reconciliation with their parents during the height of battle provided healing that had been years in the making. His formal apologies for past mistakes rendered both more poignant and more meaningful by the extreme circumstances that surrounded them. Fred's death in the explosion that brought down part of the castle wall struck Ron like a physical blow that seemed to tear something essential from his chest. The loss of his brother's laughter and mischief creating emptiness that would never be filled by anyone or anything else. The sight of Fred's face, peaceful in death but forever silenced, was perhaps the most devastating moment of Ron's life, forcing him to confront mortality in ways that no previous experience had prepared him for. The grief that threatened to paralyze him in the immediate aftermath of Fred's death was countered by rage that demanded immediate action against those responsible for such senseless loss, emotions that Harry and Hermione had to channel into constructive purpose rather than allowing them to consume him entirely. The understanding that Fred's sacrifice would be meaningless unless they completed their mission provided focus that helped Ron function despite pain that felt like it would never diminish. The journey to the Shrieking Shack to witness Nagini's attack on Severus Snape provided final confirmation that they were approaching the climactic moments of their long struggle, as Voldemort eliminated his own followers in pursuit of power that he believed would make him invincible. The memories that Snape provided to Harry with his dying breath would prove crucial to understanding the true nature of their enemy's vulnerabilities, though the full implications wouldn't become clear until much later. Harry's departure to meet Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest represented the most agonizing test of friendship that Ron had ever faced. Watching his best friend walk deliberately toward what appeared to be certain death while being unable to offer any assistance or comfort. The knowledge that Harry was choosing sacrifice to protect everyone else made his courage even more remarkable, though it also made Ron's helplessness more difficult to bear. The false victory celebration that Voldemort staged upon his return to the castle, with Harry's apparently lifeless body, created despair that was almost unbearable, as Ron processed what seemed to be the death of his best friend and the triumph of everything evil in their world. The sight of Hagrid carrying Harry's body while weeping openly was perhaps more devastating than Fred's death, representing the failure of everything they had fought for throughout their years of friendship and struggle. Neville's defiance of Voldemort in that moment of apparent defeat demonstrated the kind of courage that had been developing gradually throughout their years at Hogwarts. Transformation from frightened boy into true hero who was willing to face impossible odds for the sake of principles that were more important than personal survival. His destruction of Nagini with Godric Gryffindor's sword was both tactically crucial and symbolically perfect, representing the victory of ancient values over modern corruption. The battle that resumed when Harry revealed himself to be alive was perhaps the most intense magical combat that had ever occurred, as centuries of accumulated wisdom and power clashed with dark magic that sought to destroy everything good about their civilization. Ron fought with desperate fury fueled by grief for his brother and joy at his friend's survival. His spells cast with precision that had been refined through months of dangerous practice. The duel between Harry and Voldemort that concluded the battle was witnessed by everyone present, creating shared experience that would bind the survivors together for the rest of their lives, while providing definitive proof that evil could be defeated when good people chose to stand together against it. The sight of Voldemort's final destruction was both climactic victory and anticlimactic end, as the monster who had terrorized their world for decades was revealed to be mortal after all. The immediate aftermath of victory was marked by exhaustion that went beyond physical weariness, emotional numbness that protected them from fully processing the magnitude of what they had experienced and accomplished. The Great Hall, filled with wounded and dead, created sobering reminder that their victory had been purchased with sacrifices that could never be repaid or forgotten, losses that would influence wizarding society for generations to come. Ron's reunion with his surviving family members in the hours that followed the battle provided both comfort and renewed grief, as they celebrated their survival while mourning those who hadn't been as fortunate. The knowledge that Fred would never share another family meal or participate in another prank created emptiness that was felt by everyone who had known his irreplaceable spirit and boundless creativity. The recognition that began to flow toward the trio in the days following Voldemort's defeat felt both deserved and overwhelming, as Ron struggled to process how completely his life had been transformed by the events of the past year. The boy who had once worried about living in his brother's shadows had emerged as a hero whose courage and loyalty would be remembered long after his own lifetime ended. Though such recognition felt less important than the simple fact that his friends and family had survived to enjoy the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. The understanding that Harry's sacrifice had saved them all created debt that could never be fully repaid. Though Ron's continued friendship and support represented the most meaningful form of gratitude he could offer. Their bond, forged through years of shared adventure and tested through months of mortal danger, had emerged stronger than ever, despite the changes that war had worked on all their characters and perspectives. As Ron stood among the ruins of what had been their battlefield, surrounded by friends who had survived impossible odds and family members who would carry the scars of this conflict for the rest of their lives, he understood that their victory represented not an ending, but a beginning. The world they had saved would need to be rebuilt by people who understood the cost of freedom and the importance of preventing such conflicts from ever recurring. Work that would require the same kind of dedication and sacrifice they had shown during the darkest hours of the war itself. The peace that settled over the wizarding world in the months following Voldemort's defeat was fragile and precious, like morning dew that might disappear with the first harsh wind, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of people who had almost forgotten what it meant to live without constant fear. Ron Weasley found himself struggling to adapt to this new reality, his nervous system still attuned to threats that no longer existed, while his heart slowly learned to trust that happiness might be something more than temporary respite between disasters. The Ministry of Magic that emerged from the war's ashes was transformed in ways both visible and subtle, its corridors once again filled with the sounds of normal governmental business, rather than the whispered conversations and fearful silences that had characterized the dark months of Voldemort's influence. Kingsley Shacklebolt's appointment as permanent Minister for Magic brought leadership that understood both the practical necessities of reconstruction and the moral imperatives of preventing future conflicts through justice rather than vengeance. Ron's decision to join the Aurora training program alongside Harry felt like natural continuation of their wartime partnership, though the institutional structure and bureaucratic procedures were jarring after months of making life and death decisions without oversight or approval from higher authorities. The other trainees in their class included veterans of both sides of the recent conflict, creating complex dynamics as former enemies worked together to create law enforcement systems that could maintain peace without descending into the kind of authoritarianism they had just defeated. The curriculum that shaped their professional education was necessarily different from peacetime training, focusing on investigative techniques and conflict resolution, rather than the combat magic that had dominated their recent experiences. Ron found himself excelling at the psychological aspects of criminal investigation, his natural empathy and understanding of human motivation, providing insights that complemented Harry's more intuitive approaches to detecting deception and uncovering hidden truths. Their first cases together involved tracking down war criminals who had escaped justice during the chaos of Voldemort's final defeat, dangerous individuals whose magical skills were matched by desperate determination to avoid accountability for their actions. The manhunts that followed were complex operations, requiring patience and careful planning, skills that Ron had developed during their Horcrux quest, but which felt different when applied within legal frameworks that demanded evidence and procedural correctness. The capture of Antonin Dolohov in a ramshackle cottage near the Welsh border represented their most challenging early case, as the Death Eater had managed to avoid detection for nearly 6 months, while planning what appeared to be revenge attacks against Order members who had survived the war. The tactical planning required for his safe apprehension drew heavily on lessons learned during their time as fugitives, understanding how desperate people thought and where they were likely to seek refuge. The interrogation that followed Dolohov's capture revealed information about other Death Eaters who remained at large, creating leads that would occupy oral resources for years to come while providing evidence for trials that would help wizarding society process the trauma of recent events through formal legal proceedings. Ron's role in these interrogations was crucial, as his ability to establish rapport with prisoners often succeeded where more aggressive approaches failed completely. The recognition that came with their successful cases felt both satisfying and strange, as Ron found himself celebrated in profit articles and chocolate frog cards for achievements that felt like simple extensions of the friendship and loyalty that had always defined his character. The fame was less overwhelming than what Harry experienced, but it created its own complications, as people sought his attention for reasons that had nothing to do with who he was as a person. The relationship with Hermione that developed during this period was both natural evolution of their long friendship and entirely new territory that required navigation skills neither of them possessed from previous experience. The physical attraction that had been building for years was now acknowledged openly, but translating that recognition into functional romantic partnership required patience and communication that challenged both their assumptions about how relationships were supposed to work. Their first official date, dinner at a small restaurant in Diagon Alley, was simultaneously wonderful and awkward, as they discovered that being romantic partners required different social skills than being best friends who happened to be attracted to each other. The conversation flowed easily when they discussed work or mutual friends, but became stilted when they tried to engage in the kind of romantic dialogue that seemed to come naturally to other couples they observed. The gradual integration of their personal and professional lives created rhythm that felt sustainable over time, as they learned to balance individual career ambitions with shared domestic goals while maintaining the friendships that had sustained them through their darkest moments. Sunday dinners at the Burrow became anchors for their weekly routines, providing family connections that remained crucial for both their emotional health and their sense of purpose in post-war society. The decision to move in together after 18 months of dating was pragmatic as much as romantic, as their Aurora schedules often required unconventional hours that made maintaining separate residences inefficient and emotionally unsatisfying. The flat they chose in a quiet corner of Wizarding London was modest but comfortable, its rooms filled with books, Quidditch memorabilia, and magical devices that reflected their shared interests and complementary personalities. Ron's growing reputation within the Aurora department was based not on flashy individual achievements but on steady competence and reliability that made him invaluable for complex cases requiring long-term investigation and careful coordination between different magical law enforcement agencies. His ability to work effectively with people from various backgrounds and magical traditions made him particularly useful for international cases that required cultural sensitivity as well as investigative skill. The capture of a smuggling ring that was trafficking dangerous magical creatures across multiple national borders required months of undercover work that tested Ron's acting abilities and psychological endurance in ways that his wartime experiences hadn't prepared him for. The false identity he maintained as a corrupt ministry official seeking profitable side ventures was convincing enough to gain the criminals' trust while gathering evidence that would ultimately result in convictions that protected both magical creatures and the communities they might have. In Diagon, the stress of maintaining such deceptions for extended periods reminded Ron why he had found their polyjuice infiltration of the ministry so emotionally exhausting. Understanding that pretending to be someone else required constant vigilance that was mentally draining, even when physical danger wasn't immediate. The relief he felt when the operation concluded successfully was matched by appreciation for work that allowed him to be himself while serving causes he believed in. The promotion to Senior Auror that came after 2 years of distinguished service was accompanied by responsibilities for training junior officers and coordinating investigations that involved multiple departments within the ministry's Fleur law enforcement structure. Ron found himself enjoying the mentoring aspects of his new position, understanding that sharing knowledge and experience with younger Aurors was perhaps more important than any individual cases he might solve personally. But the administrative demands of senior rank began to wear on him in ways that he hadn't anticipated, as paperwork and bureaucratic procedures consumed time and energy that he would have preferred to spend on actual investigation and direct action against criminal activity. The meetings and reports that dominated his schedule felt increasingly disconnected from the hands-on police work that had attracted him to the profession in the first place. George's struggle to maintain Weasley's wizard wheezes without Fred's creative partnership and emotional support created family crisis that affected everyone who cared about him, his grief manifesting in ways that were both understandable and deeply concerning. The shop that had once been filled with laughter and innovative magical pranks became a monument to loss, its shelves increasingly empty, as George found himself unable to develop new products or maintain enthusiasm for the business they had built together. Ron's visits to the shop during his off-duty hours revealed the depth of his brother's depression and the extent to which Fred's death had shattered not just George's business partnership, but his sense of identity and purpose. The conversations they shared were often stilted and painful, as Ron struggled to provide comfort and support while respecting George's need to grieve in his own way and at his own pace. The decision to leave the Auror department and join George at the joke shop was not made lightly, requiring extensive discussions with Hermione and careful consideration of how such a career change would affect both their relationship and their long-term financial security. The knowledge that George needed family support more than the wizarding world needed another senior Auror ultimately made the choice clear, though Ron knew that some people would interpret his decision as abandonment of prestigious career for less respectable commercial enterprise. The transition from law enforcement to retail business required learning entirely new skills, as Ron discovered that managing inventory, dealing with suppliers, and maintaining customer relations demanded different kinds of patience and creativity than criminal investigation had required. The magical products that filled the shop's shelves were more complex than they appeared, requiring understanding of both their practical applications and their potential for misuse by customers who didn't appreciate their true capabilities. Working alongside George provided opportunities for the kind of close collaboration that Ron had missed since leaving the Auror department, though the emotional dynamics were complicated by George's continuing grief and his tendency to see Fred in every corner of the shop they had created together. The gradual healing that occurred as they rebuilt the business was marked by small victories, moments when George's laughter returned, or his enthusiasm for new product development briefly overcame his sadness. The success that Weasley's Wizard Wheezes achieved under their joint management exceeded everyone's expectations, as Ron's practical business sense and George's creative genius combined to create magical products that captured the post-war market's hunger for joy and harmless mischief. The shop became a gathering place for young wizards who had grown up during the conflict and were eager to experience the kind of carefree fun that their childhoods had largely lacked. The engagement ring that Ron presented to Hermione on a quiet evening in their shared flat was not the largest or most expensive that Diagon Alley's jewelers could provide, but it was chosen with care and presented with words that came from his heart rather than romantic formula he had read in books or observed in other couples. Her acceptance was immediate and wholehearted, confirming what both of them had known for years, even when they hadn't been ready to acknowledge it openly. The wedding planning that followed was simultaneously joyful and stressful, as they balanced their desire for intimate celebration with family expectations and social obligations that came with their public profiles as war heroes. The ceremony that they ultimately chose reflected their shared values and aesthetic preferences, while honoring traditions that mattered to their respective families, creating memories that would sustain them through whatever challenges their marriage might face. The wedding itself, held in the Burrow's garden on a perfect spring morning, was attended by friends and family members who had shared their journey from childhood through war to this moment of hope and commitment. Harry's speech as best man was both hilarious and heartfelt, celebrating their friendship while acknowledging how much all of them had grown and changed since their first meeting on the Hogwarts Express so many years earlier. The honeymoon they spent touring magical communities throughout Europe provided opportunities to see how other cultures approached magic and family life, experiences that broadened their perspectives while reinforcing their appreciation for the community and traditions that had shaped their own values and aspirations. The quiet weeks away from familiar responsibilities allowed them to establish patterns of communication and cooperation that would serve their marriage well in years to come. Their return to London and resumed work at the joke shop was marked by increased confidence in their partnership, both personal and professional, as they tackled challenges that might have seemed overwhelming to either of them individually. The expansion of their product line to include educational magical items and safety equipment reflected Ron's influence on the business direction, complementing George's focus on entertainment and humor with practical applications that served broader market needs. Rose Weasley's birth 2 years after their wedding transformed Ron's understanding of love and responsibility in ways that no previous experience had prepared him for. The sight of his daughter's perfect features and obvious intelligence, creating emotional connections that were immediate and overwhelming. The protective instincts that had always characterized his relationships with family and friends intensified to levels that sometimes surprised him with their intensity. The balancing act between parenthood and professional obligations required adjustments that neither he nor Hermione had fully anticipated, as their daughter's needs took priority over business concerns, while their relationship had to adapt to include this new person whose welfare was more important than their own comfort or convenience. The sleepless nights and endless feedings were exhausting, but they also provided intimacy and shared purpose that strengthened their marriage bonds. Hugo's arrival 3 years later completed their nuclear family while creating new logistical challenges, as two children required different approaches to discipline, education, and entertainment than one child had demanded. Ron's natural playfulness and patience made him effective at managing the chaos that accompanied young children, while Hermione's organizational skills ensured that their household routines provided stability and structure that supported everyone's needs. The godfather role that Harry asked him to accept for James Sirius Potter was both honor and responsibility that Ron took seriously, understanding that such positions created obligations that extended far beyond ceremonial functions. The relationship that developed between him and his godson was warm and natural, built on shared interests in Quidditch and mischief that echoed Ron's own childhood connections with his uncles and older family friends. The recognition that came with inclusion on chocolate frog cards felt surreal to Ron, who remembered collecting such cards as a child and never imagining that his own face might someday appear among the famous witches and wizards whose achievements were celebrated in confectionery form. The brief biography that accompanied his card emphasized his role in Voldemort's defeat and his contributions to post-war magical law enforcement, though it barely mentioned the daily acts of loyalty and courage that had made such achievements possible. The interviews that occasionally accompanied their celebrity status became easier over time, as Ron learned to balance honesty about their experiences with discretion about details that might cause pain to people who had lost family members during the war. The questions about his friendship with Harry and his relationship with Hermione were repetitive but generally respectful, though he sometimes struggled with reporters who seemed more interested in gossip than genuine information about their work or values. The financial security that their various enterprises provided allowed Ron to support extended family members who had been affected by the war's economic disruptions, quietly providing assistance to widows and orphans whose needs might otherwise have gone unmet. The knowledge that his success could help others gave additional meaning to work that was already satisfying, creating sense of purpose that extended beyond personal achievement or family welfare. The Burrow gatherings that marked holidays and special occasions became increasingly precious as family members pursued their individual careers and geographic circumstances made regular contact more challenging. The conversations that flowed around Molly's kitchen table now included grandchildren's voices and new perspectives brought by marriage partners, creating continuity that connected past traditions with future possibilities. Arthur's retirement from the ministry provided opportunities for extended conversations about Muggle technology and magical innovation that had fascinated them both throughout Ron's childhood. Discussions that took on new depth as Ron's adult experiences allowed him to appreciate his father's wisdom and curiosity in ways that hadn't been possible during his teenage years. The fishing trips and workshop projects they shared became treasured memories that would sustain Ron through whatever challenges lay ahead. Bill and Charlie's visits to England became rare and precious occasions, as their international careers kept them occupied with responsibilities that limited family contact to letters and occasional holiday appearances. The stories they shared about curse-breaking and dragon-handling adventures provided entertainment while reinforcing Ron's appreciation for the quieter life he had chosen, surrounded by familiar people and predictable challenges rather than constant danger and exotic locations. Percy's gradual reintegration into family social events was handled with characteristic Weasley combination of forgiveness and gentle teasing, as past conflicts were acknowledged but not allowed to overshadow present relationships and future possibilities. His success in ministry administration was respected even when his political views created minor disagreements, understanding that family bonds were more important than ideological differences. Ginny's marriage to Harry created new dynamics within the family structure while strengthening existing connections, as their children added another generation to the complex web of relationships that had sustained the Weasleys through decades of joy and tragedy. The nieces and nephews, who bore various combinations of Potter and Weasley traits, represented hope for the future while creating continuity with family traditions that stretched back through generations. The aging that became visible in his parents as years passed was both natural and poignant, reminding Ron that the people who had shaped his character and provided unconditional love throughout his childhood would not be part of his life forever. The increased frequency of his visits to the Burrow reflected understanding that time with loved ones was precious and finite, requiring conscious effort to maintain relationships that might otherwise be taken for granted. The success that Weasley's Wizard Wheezes achieved under his and George's management created opportunities to establish scholarship funds for students whose families couldn't afford magical education, ensuring that financial limitations wouldn't prevent talented young witches and wizards from developing their abilities. The knowledge that their business could create opportunities for others gave additional meaning to work that was already personally fulfilling and financially rewarding. The quiet satisfaction that characterized Ron's adult life was built on foundations of friendship, family, and service that had been established during his youth and tested through experiences that revealed the strength of his character when circumstances demanded courage and sacrifice. The recognition that came with his contributions to Voldemort's defeat was gratifying, but the daily happiness he found in marriage, parenthood, and meaningful work provided deeper satisfaction than public acclaim could ever offer. The man who had once worried about living in his brother's shadows had created his own legacy through choices that reflected his values and priorities, demonstrating that heroism could be found in ordinary decisions as well as extraordinary circumstances. The loyalty that had always been his defining characteristic had evolved into wisdom that recognized the importance of commitment, perseverance, and love in creating lives that mattered both to those who lived them and to the communities they served. As Ron looked toward the future from the perspective of middle age, surrounded by family and engaged in work that provided both personal satisfaction and service to others, he understood that the adventures of his youth had prepared him for the different but equally important challenges of adult responsibility. The boy who had dreamed of glory and recognition had become a man who found meaning in the daily acts of love and service that created happiness for those he cared about, while contributing to the common good of the society they had fought to preserve. Rest now, faithful friend, as our tale of Ronald Weasley draws to its gentle close. In the quiet warmth of this peaceful hour, let yourself be comforted by the memory of a boy who proved that heroism isn't about being first or best, but about standing by those you love when it matters most. His freckled face and loyal heart may have started in shadows cast by others, but he emerged into his own bright light through courage, friendship, and an unshakable moral compass. As you drift toward dreams, remember that true strength often lies not in magic or fame, but in the simple choice to stay, to fight, to love, even when it's difficult. Ron's greatest spell wasn't cast with a wand, but with his heart, the magic of loyalty that never wavered, friendship that never broke, and love that conquered every fear. Sleep well, knowing that in your own life, such everyday heroism is always possible, and that sometimes the most ordinary hearts beat with the most extraordinary courage. Sweet dreams, and may you find Ron Weasley's steadfast loyalty in your own friendships. Always.